Section 32 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Thomas Hardy's Heroines. If I restrict myself somewhat in the space given to Mr. Hardy's heroines, and seem scantly to treat of them in a paper or two, it is not because I value them less than the heroines of some novelists with whom I have allowed myself a wider range. But I am sensible that with all their witchery they are of a sisterhood, or at the most a cousinhood, which may be more typically represented, and that with their strong individual characters there is a strong family likeness among them all, which may be suggested in the figures and actions of a few. 1. I recall distinctly the order of my acquaintance with these lovely, if somewhat illusive ladies. It began with Elfrida Swancourt in A Pair of Blue Eyes, who revealed to me a fresh conception of the ever womanly, and in whose fate passion and caprice, comedy and tragedy were so strangely mingled that one remembers her with a sigh that is half a smile, and an adoration that rather slights its idol. She remained somehow exterior both to what she suffered and to what she did. It happened to her, or from her, but she did not seem responsible for it. Fancy Dare in Under the Greenwood Tree was morally more trammelled both in the cause and consequence, yet she too was warped along by the toils of fate rather than moved by her own will. And in fact, most of the women of Mr. Hardy could urge that they had to do the things they did, even when they wished to do them. This was not quite so much the case with Bathsheba Everdene in Far from the Madding Crowd as with some others. She, for a Hardy heroine, had a degree of control over her destiny which might almost be called free will. At least, she was not so much the prey of determinism as most of the others. It is true that she yields to a sort of fascination in Sergeant Troy, but only as all women in love do. She no more keeps her head than she keeps her heart in the mistaken marriage she makes. She has a powerful will which does not avail her so much in the great as in the little things, and she has a sturdy common sense of pretty much the same effect. Yet she is, upon the whole, the least wrought upon by her environment, and the most absolute of her sisterhood. The larger part of these are self-willed rather than strong-willed, as is eminently the case with Paula Power in the Laodicean. That is not nearly so great a novel as Far from the Madding Crowd, but it is of a peculiar charm, because it is the full expression of the sort of feminine personality which will bewitch men as long as the shifty graces of a weather vane more take their fancy in women than the steadfast virtues of the sky-pointing steeple. Each worshipper hopes that somehow the vane, when it turns in his favor, will stand still there, and in fact this is what commonly happens first or last. Paula Power veered with most winds that blew, but while her purposes shifted, her fancy was fixed in the young architect who had caught it and who kept it, in spite of all her turning. She was more nearly a society person than Mr. Hardy commonly paints, and had less of primitive earthiness than almost any of his heroines. In that terrible group of noble dames with whom he makes us acquainted in a series of wonderful histories, the tellular quality of their natures is so much more appreciable than even the mundane, that they seem beings emancipated by their potent caprices and propensities from all the social obligations, and are not so much grandes dames as predatory creatures set by their caste above the moral law. Mr. Hardy's heroines are good, or they are bad, or they are now good and now bad, according to some inner impulse from some agency deeper or more primal than conscience. When they feel the pull of the moral law, they yield it a partial and provisional allegiance, as Fancy Dare does in Under the Greenwood Tree, when she finds herself so differently in love with the vicar and with Dick the tranter, that she is unable to reconcile the conflicting passions, and acquires what merit she can by frankly owning the fact to the vicar and renouncing him. Or as the pretty widow in The Distracted Young Preacher, who acknowledges the error of smuggling, but sees some excuse for herself and her neighbors in the fact they only do it in the winter. Perhaps we may best define the sort of woman this novelist places before us so livingly that we cannot doubt their reality, by a process of exclusion in which we need not go farther than to say that they are wholly unlike American women. They are of the same stock racially, but ours are of a graft upon the parent stem so different that the two varieties of fruit are as little related as plums and apricots. In the Hardy lower class heroines we see the primitive English woman before she was touched by Puritanism, and in his middle and upper class heroines the same woman as she has grown into modern civilization unaffected by the tremendous force which has permeated and molded the nature of the American great grandnieces of that original Englishwoman. I have often wondered what character untouched by Puritanism was like, and I fancy that in the Hardy heroines I have seen. And if I cannot altogether approve of it, I can own its charm, as I can willingly acknowledge the ugliness and error and soul sickness which Puritanism produced in building up our intensely personalized American conscience. If we take the case even of such a character as Sue Broadhead in Jude, with her hysterically exaggerated impulses toward what her conscience bids her do, we have the nervous impressibility of the Puritanized woman, but we are made finally aware that it is the like effect of wholly different causes. It is the ecclesiasticized conscience which works in this English girl, not the personalized conscience which would drive a like American girl to the same frenetic extremes. Oddly enough, as the reader will perhaps think, I am inclined to regard Ethelberta in The Hand of Ethelberta as one of the highest minded of Mr. Hardy's women. At least she is one of those least swayed by passion, and of a mind the least darkened by exhalations from those dregs of pagan earthiness which lie at the base of his woman's natures. She is quite unselfish, and her ambition is for her family and the advancement of its modest fortunes. When the employment of her unique gift as a public story teller makes it advisable for her to establish herself in London, and she takes a house there, with her brother for a page, one sister for cook, and the other for housemaid, and her mother for a sort of upper servant, they all understand that it is for their good and not for her glory, and they acquiesce with the affection for her which she feels for them, and which she never fails to show on proper occasion. Dinner in a nobleman's house, where her father the butler waits behind her chair while she figures as the celebrity of the hour, is not a proper occasion, and she reserves the display of her filial love for the meetings with her father behind her own doors. Even in the case of her young lover, whom she gives up for the bad-natured but good-humoured old lord whom she marries. She has never been so much in love with him, but she was willing to get him for her sister Picotee, and when she finds out how very wicked her amiable old lord is, she does her best to escape from him. Being prevented, she remains and reforms him. The scheme is the most fantastic of Mr. Hardy's plots, but it must be owned it is delightful, and Ethelberta is one of the most delightful, as well as one of the most respectable, of his heroines. She is not quite candid, but, as I said, she is very unselfish, and I do not know that she has her moral superior in his fiction, except Anne Garland in The Trumpet Major, or a pensive figure like Grace Melbury in The Woodlanders. Anne is the sweetest and freshest of his girls, and is of that level of life on which his muse seems to find herself most at home. She is above the lowest, but not so high as to tempt the author aside from her character to the complications of her social environment, which is indeed very simple. She is quite, though rather passively, constant to a lover who is rather actively inconstant, but finally true to the young fancy they have had for each other. And she is, I hazard the notion, innately perhaps the most ladylike of Mr. Hardy's creations. One heart-breaking presence among these I could not ignore without accusing myself of insensibility, and yet I cannot name Tess, in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, without a feeling of imperfection in the handling of her character, which I might not be able to make apparent. I do not know that I wish to make it apparent, and I will only say that, profoundly pathetic as she is, Tess seems to me wanting in unity. She seems the effect of two successive impulses of the author's imagination. In the first part of the story she is one Tess, whom the other Tess, in the last part, does not so much grow out of as seem joined to. They are halves of two figurines, found in the same soil, and compact of the same clay, not belonging originally together, but joined by voluntary and conscious skill. I have owned that it would be difficult to prove this, and I shall not be hurt if the reader does not agree with me, or throws things at me in defense of one of the most pathetic heroines of fiction. Yet I am inclined to hold to my opinion, and I will ask any irate differer to compare her evolution with that of Eustacia Vi, for instance, in The Return of the Native. Poor Eustacia, with her sordid ambition and her selfish dreams of happiness, her selfish ideals of love, and her essential cold-heartedness in spite of her warm-bloodedness, is one to command the least respect among a generation of ladies who all command one's amused liking rather than one's respect, unless indeed it be that heroine of The Mayor of Casterbridge, whom I shadowily remember as possibly shadier still, but whom I cannot recall by name. 2. Eustacia Vi is one of those natures whose social evolution interests you so little that you do not care how vaguely it is suggested. We first find her in her grandfather's house on Egdon Heath, of which she is very fit to be the tutelary spirit, though she alone among the characters is not native to it, and has an ideal of life wholly alien to the wild and simple and solemn place. She longs for excitement and for worldly triumphs and artificial splendors, and at Egdon she has only a lover whom she cannot marry, and another whom, having married, she wearies of, though he is good and fine, and above her in everything but ambition. It is seldom that an author presents a heroine so palpably as Eustacia is shown in these richly descriptive passages. Eustacia Vi was the raw material of a divinity. On Olympus she would have done well with a little preparation. She had the passions and instincts which make a model goddess, that is, those which make not quite a model woman. She was in person full-limbed and somewhat heavy, without ruddiness as without pallor, and soft to the touch as a cloud. To see her hair was to fancy that a whole winter did not contain darkness enough to form its shadow. It closed over her forehead like nightfall extinguishing the western glow. Her nerves extended into those tresses, and her temper could always be softened by stroking them down. When her hair was brushed, she would instantly sink into stillness and look like the Sphinx. She had pagan eyes, full of nocturnal mysteries. Their light, as it came and went, and came again, was partially hampered by their oppressive lids and lashes, and of these the underlid was much fuller than it usually is with English women. This enabled her to indulge in reverie without seeming to do so. She might have been believed capable of sleeping without closing them up. The mouth seemed formed less to speak than to quiver, less to quiver than to kiss. Some might have added, less to kiss than to curl. One had fancied that such lip curves were mostly lurking underground in the South as fragments of forgotten marbles. So fine were the lines of her lips that, though full, each corner of her mouth was as clearly cut as the point of a spear. This keenness of corner was only blunted when she was given over to sudden fits of gloom, one of the phases of the night side of sentiment which she knew too well for her years. In this portrait the whole passionately selfish drama of the woman is suggested. Wildeve, a strange, lawless earth spirit of like generation, trifles with her love, and her fancy wanders from him to Clym who returns from Paris and settles down on the heath after his eyesight is threatened as a furze cutter. She does not mean to let him stay there, but to make him take her to Paris, or out into the world somewhere. And from time to time she sees Wildeve after her marriage to Clym and at last elopes with him, and they are drowned together in the Weir. Mr. Hardy loves to keep close to nature in all his novels, but in none do we feel the breath of the earth as in this. The story keeps to the circuit of the lonely heath, with its few farms and hamlets, and much of it befalls by night, as suits the dusky soul of the heroine. A very significant bit as regards her, and very characteristic as regards the courageous humour of the author, is that passage in which she keeps her bargain with the simple-hearted country boy, who lends her his costume for a masquerading adventure, on condition that she will let him hold her hand for a quarter of an hour. The next evening Eustacia stood punctually at the fuel house door, waiting for the dusk which was to bring Charlie with the trappings. He appeared on the dark ridge of heathland. "Here are the things," he whispered, placing them upon the threshold. "And now, Miss Eustacia, the payment. It is quite ready. I am as good as my word." She leaned against the door post and gave him her hand. Charlie took it in both his own with a tenderness beyond description, unless it was like that of a child holding a captured sparrow. "Why, there's a glove on it," he said, in a deprecating way. "I've been walking," she observed. "But, miss—" "Well, it is hardly fair." She pulled off the glove and gave him her bare hand. They stood together without further speech, each looking at the blackening scene, and each thinking his and her own thoughts. "I think I won't use it all up to night," said Charlie, when 6 or 8 minutes had been passed by them, hand in hand. "May I have the other few minutes another time?" "As you like," said she, without the least emotion. "But it must be over in a week. Now there is only one thing I want you to do, to wait while I put on the dress, and then to see if I do my part properly. But let me look first indoors." She vanished for a minute or two, and went in. Her grandfather was safely asleep in his chair. "Now then," she said on returning, "walk down the garden a little way, and when I am ready I'll call you." Charlie walked and waited, and presently heard a soft whistle. He returned to the fuel house door. She struck the light, revealing herself to be changed in sex, brilliant in colours, and armed from top to toe. Perhaps she quailed a little under Charlie's vigorous gaze, but whether any shyness appeared upon her countenance could not be seen, by reason of the strips of ribbon which used to cover the face in mumming costumes, representing the barred visor of the mediaeval helmet. "It fits pretty well," she said, looking down at the white overalls, "except that the tunic, or whatever you call it, is long in the sleeve. The bottom of the overalls I can turn up inside. Now you may leave me." "Yes, miss, but I think I'll have 1 minute more of what I am owed, if you don't mind." Eustacia gave him her hand as before. "1 minute," she said, and at about the proper interval counted on till she reached 7 or 8. Hand and person she then withdrew to a distance of several feet, and recovered some of her old dignity. The contract completed, she raised between them a barrier impenetrable as a wall. "There, 'tis all gone, and I didn't mean quite all," he said with a sigh. A whimsical comedy in the neighbouring heath dwellers plays round the central tragedy, and gilds with its phosphorescent gaiety the gloom of the whelming doom. When it has come to Eustacia's feigning absence from home, and letting her husband's mother toil back to her own house through the midday heat that kills her, the end is already in view, for she has not opened her door because Waldev is within. In the scene with her husband which follows, Eustatia's peculiar nature is allowed to make itself felt in terms curiously wanting in dramatic intensity, but somehow adequate to the situation. He comes home early in the morning, and goes straight to her room. The noise of his arrival must have aroused her, for when he opened the door, she was standing before the looking glass in her nightdress, the ends of her hair gathered into one hand, with which she was coiling the whole mass round her head, previous to beginning toilette operations. She was not a woman given to speaking first at a meeting, and she allowed Clem to walk across in silence without turning her head. He came behind her, and she saw his face in the glass. It was ashy, haggard, and terrible. Instead of starting towards him in sorrowful surprise, as even Eustacia, undemonstrative wife as she was, would have done in days before she burdened herself with a secret, she remained motionless, looking at him in the glass. And while she looked, the carmine flush with which warmth and sound sleep had suffused her cheeks and neck dissolved from view, and the death-like pallor in his face flew across into hers. He was close enough to see this, and the sight instigated his tongue. "You know what is the matter," he said, huskily. "I see it in your face." Her hand relinquished the rope of hair, and dropped to her side, and the pile of tresses, no longer supported, fell from the crown of her head about her shoulders, and over the white nightgown in inky streams. She made no reply. "Speak to me," said Yeobright, peremptorily. The blanching process did not cease in her, and her lips now became as white as her face. One familiar with the Stoic philosophy would have fancied that he saw the delicate tissue of her soul extricating itself from her body, and leaving it a simple heap of old clay. She turned to him and said, "Yes, Clem, I'll speak to you. Why do you return so early? Can I do anything for you?" "Yes, you can listen to me. It seems that my wife is not very well." "Why?" "Your face, my dear, your face. Or perhaps it is the pale morning light which takes your colour away. Now I am going to reveal a secret to you. Ha, ha! Oh, that is ghastly. What? Your laugh. There's reason for ghastliness, Eustacia. You have held my happiness in the hollow of your hand, and like a devil you have dashed it down." She started back from her dressing-table, retreated a few steps from him, and looked him in the face. "Ah, you think to frighten me," she said, with a slight laugh. "Is it worth while? I am undefended and alone." "How extraordinary! What do you mean? As there is ample time, I will tell you, though you know well enough. I mean that it is extraordinary that you should be alone in my absence." "Tell me now, where is he who was with you on the afternoon of the 31st of August? Under the bed? Up the chimney?" A shudder overcame her, and shook the light fabric of her night dress throughout. "I do not remember dates so exactly," she said. "I cannot recollect that anybody was with me besides yourself." Their quarrel ends in her leaving the house, and at last the reader's heart almost turns to her in her self-pity, cruel and false as she has been. "Oh, oh, oh!" she cried, breaking down at last, and shaking with sobs which choked her, she sank upon her knees. "Oh, will you have done? Oh, you are too relentless. There's a limit to the cruelty of savages. I have held out long, but you crush me down. I beg for mercy. I cannot bear this any longer. It is inhuman to go farther with this. If I had killed your mother with my own hand, I should not deserve such a scourging to the bone as this. Oh, oh, God have mercy upon a miserable woman. You have beaten me in this game. I beg you to stay your hand in pity. I am going from this house. We cannot both stay here." She hastily dressed herself, Gilbride moodily walking up and down the room the whole of the time. At last all her things were on. Her poor little hands quivered so violently as she held them to her chin to fasten her bonnet that she could not tie the strings, and after a few moments she relinquished the attempt. Seeing this, he moved forward and said, "Let me tie them." She assented in silence, and lifted her chin. For once, at least, in her life she was totally oblivious of the charm of her attitude. But he was not, and he turned his eyes aside that he might not be tempted to softness. 3. Elfrida Swancourt, as compared with such an earth spirit as Eustacia Vi, is an air spirit, but she is quite as strictly of this world. One has a greater tenderness for her, and realizes that in her love affairs, so swiftly successive as to be almost simultaneous, she is quite unselfish, or at least she seeks her happiness only in that of the man she loves. She suffers cruel rejection and punishment through Henry Knight, on whom her heart is truly set because he thinks her a flirt, and is retroactively jealous of the young architect, Stephen Smith, and cannot understand how she might have had a fancy for another before she was fixed in her passion for himself. But she recovers from the blow sufficiently to marry Lord Luxellian, and the final pathos of her story is not for her heartbreak, but for her early death. The pang of this is such that it is difficult to get back of the fact to that earlier consciousness of her, in which one could laugh when an older woman said of her that Elfrida would talk like a philosopher, but would behave like a robin in a greenhouse. This, indeed, was true of her mainly in minor matters of conduct. She was equal to the more heroic demands of life. There is a lovely honesty in her which mainly characterizes her, in spite of much folly and heedless risk and downright defection. That is, she gives her fancy to Stephen Smith, and then she gives her heart to Henry Knight, without losing the reader's respect. For people change, and one preference pushes out another without sin, though not without suffering. It is the hard lot of women, that though they cannot always inspire men with constancy, they so embody men's highest ideal of it, that they cannot change without violence to that ideal. They are therefore obliged to use finesse when perhaps they would rather not, and try to seem unchanging even while they change. It was Elfrida's difficult problem to make Knight feel that she had never loved any one but him, while confronted in her own consciousness by the fact that in a different, if somewhat more ignorant way, she had at least very much liked being loved by Stephen Smith, if she had not loved him. She was really engaged to Smith when she met Knight, and she had somehow to get rid of the old love before reconciling herself to happiness in the new. The affair was possible in its subjective implications, but objectively it countered with the devoted and exacting passion of Knight, and ended badly. Nothing more prettily suggests this charming girl's complexity of emotion and simplicity of action than a scene which will have remained in every reader's memory, one of Mr. Hardy's peculiarly audacious and intimate scenes. With Knight she has got over the face of a lofty seaward cliff, and when he finds it impossible to return to her, he helps her to get back, and remains clinging to a face of rock, where his hold must give way in a few minutes. There is no time to run for help, and there is none at hand except in her own wit. On a sudden, we are told, she vanished over the bank from his sight. She was gone for what seemed to him an eternity, but when she reappeared, he noticed, as he looked up at her, that in her arms she bore a bundle of white linen, and that her form was singularly attenuated. So preternaturally thin and flexible was Elfrida at this moment, that she appeared to bend under the light blows of the rain shafts as they struck into her sides and bosom, and splintered into spray on her face. She sat down and hurriedly began rending the linen into strips. Those she knotted end to end, and afterwards twisted them like the strands of a cord. In a short space of time she had formed a perfect rope by this means, 6 or 7 yards long. "Can you wait while I bind it?" she said, anxiously extending her gaze down to him. "Yes, if not very long. Hope has given me a wonderful instalment of strength." Elfrida wound the lengthy string she had thus formed round and round the linen rope, which was now firm in every part. "When you have let it down," said Knight, already resuming his position of ruling power, "go back from the edge of the slope, and over the bank as far as the rope will allow you. Then lean down and hold the end with both hands." "I have tied it round my waist," she cried, "and I will lean directly upon the bank, holding with my hands as well." It was the arrangement he had thought of, but would not suggest. "I will raise and drop it 3 times when I am behind the bank," she continued, "to signify that I am ready. Take care, oh, take the greatest care, I beg of you." She dropped the rope over him to learn how much of its length it would be necessary to expend on that side of the bank, went back, and disappeared as she had done before. The rope was trailing by Knight's shoulders. In a few moments it moved 3 times. He waited yet a second or two, then laid hold. Half a dozen extensions of the arms, alternating with half a dozen seizures of the rope with his feet, brought him up to the level of the soil. He was saved, and sprang over the bank. At sight of him she leaped to her feet with almost a shriek of joy. Knight's eyes met hers, and with supreme eloquence the glance of each told a long concealed tale of emotion in that short half moment. Moved by an impulse neither could resist, they ran together and into each other's arms. An overwhelming rush of exultation at having delivered the man she revered from one of the most terrible forms of death shook the gentle girl to the centre of her soul. It merged in a defiance of duty to Stephen, and a total recklessness as to plighted faith. Every nerve of her will was now in entire subjection to her feeling. Volition, as a guiding power, had forsaken her. To remain passive as she remained now, encircled by his arms, was a sufficiently complete result, a glorious crown to all the years of her life. Elfrida recovered herself, and gently struggled to be free. He reluctantly relinquished her, and then surveyed her from crown to toe. She seemed as small as an infant. He perceived whence she had obtained the rope. "Elfrida, my Elfrida!" he exclaimed in gratified amazement. "I must leave you now," she said, her face doubling its red with an expression between gladness and shame. "You follow me, but at some distance." Behind the bank, while night reclined upon the dizzy slope, waiting for death, she had taken off her whole clothing, and replaced only her outer robe and skirt. Every thread of the remainder lay upon the ground in the form of a woolen and cotton rope. She then ran off from him through the pelting rain like a hare, or more like a pheasant when, scampering away with a lowered tail, it has a mind to fly, but does not. End of Section 32. Section 33 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Thomas Hardy's Bathsheba Everdene and Paula Power. Each great novelist arrives at rather than with his own way of looking at life. When he begins to make himself known to us, he is not himself alone, but the masters also who have gone before him, and who gradually leave him to himself as he shows more and more his ultimate power. All this, which is true of all novelists, is less true of Mr. Hardy than almost any other. He seemed to come from nowhere in literature, to be without preoccupations or affinities. The effect, perhaps, of his training in an art which is one of the most objective, and the farthest in its immemorial simplicities from the manifold consciousnesses of the literary art. Before he was a novelist, he was an architect, and what clung to him from tradition or association was not some other man's literary method or manner, but the habit of thinking, as it were, in plastic terms, and of using words structurally. To be sure, when he first attracted criticism, people thought him like George Eliot, but it seems to me that this was a mistaken impression, from their both dealing so largely with rustic life. The spirit of their respective dealing with it was not at all the same, and I do not think that Mr. Hardy's way of looking at life of any level is like the way of any novelist before him. As nearly as I can put it to myself, it is the vision of humanity, as little as possibly affected by those influences from without, religious and moral, which we anxiously enough mistake for impulses. It is the sense of das Ding an sich, which we so rarely have had that we might say we never had it before. This is the first impression we have of life as Mr. Hardy shows it, But then we begin to perceive very gradually, but at last fully, how this primitive material is affected by experience, when the experience is vital, as most experience is not, and how it loses its original simplicity through experience and becomes a living soul. A vast number of the men and women in his novels never reach this development, but remain a part of mere nature, like the cattle and poultry, the trees, the soil. They are delightful company, just as these animate and inanimate things are. They are souls, and doubtless will live hereafter, but they are not living souls here and now. They are like sheep and goats that nourish a blind life within the brain. Sometimes Mr. Hardy's people pass through tremendous experiences, and seem very little the more alive for them. A beautiful, perhaps a supreme, effort of his art is that his characters are in the last extreme of discovery, impalpably veiled from your knowledge, as people are whom you know best in the waking and working world. Something is still kept back, possibly for the final intimacies of another state of being. 1. Do we ever come thoroughly to know Bathsheba Everdene in Far from the Madding Crowd? No more, I fancy, than if we were of her most familiar acquaintance. We understand the workings of her mind, and feel their charm, but that ultimate reason of her being, for which imagination aches in vain, is the secret which is kept from the author himself. He is the greater power because of the reservation. If he could and would tell all, he would not be the master he is. And perhaps if he could explain her as exhaustively as we wish, she would not be a woman. Our mystification, which continues to the end, begins with the first glimpses of Bathsheba which we share with her lover, Gabriel Oak. The sluggish day began to break. He heard the steps of a horse at the foot of the hill, and soon there appeared in view an auburn pony with a girl on its back, ascending by the path leading past the cattle shed. Here he ensconced himself, and peeped through the loophole in the direction of the rider's approach. She came up and looked around, then on the other side of the hedge. The path, after passing the cowshed, bisected the plantation. It was not a bridle path, merely a pedestrian track, and the boughs spread horizontally at a height not greater than 7 feet above the ground, which made it impossible to ride erect beneath them. The girl, who wore no riding habit, looked around for a moment, as if to assure herself that all humanity was out of view, then dexterously dropped backwards flat upon the pony's back, her head over its tail, her feet against its shoulder, and her eyes to the sky. The rapidity of her glide into this position was that of a kingfisher, its noiselessness that of a hawk. Gabriel's eyes had scarcely been able to follow her. The tall, lank pony seemed used to such phenomena, and ambled along unconcerned. Thus she passed under the level boughs. She had no side saddle, and it was very apparent that a firm seat upon the smooth leather beneath her was unattainable sideways. Springing to her accustomed perpendicular, like a bowed sapling, she seated herself in the manner demanded by the saddle, though hardly expected of the woman. An hour passed. The girl returned, properly seated now, with a bag of bran in front of her. On nearing the cattle shed, she was met by a boy bringing a milking pail, who held the reins of the pony while she slid off. The boy led away the horse, leaving the pail with the young woman. Soon soft spurts, alternating with loud spurts, came in regular succession from within the shed. They were the sounds of a person milking a cow. Gabriel took the lost hat in his hand, and waited beside the path she would follow in leaving the hill. She came, the pail in one hand, hanging against her knee. The left arm was extended as a balance, enough of it being shown bare to make Oak wish that the event had happened in summer, when the whole would have been revealed. She seemed tall, but the pail was a small one, and the hedge diminutive; hence, making allowance for error by comparison with these, she could have been not above the height to be chosen by women as best. All features of consequence were severe and regular. From the contours of her figure in its upper part, she must have had a beautiful neck and shoulders, but since her infancy nobody had ever seen them. Had she been put into a low dress, she would have run and thrust her head into a bush. Yet she was not a shy girl by any means; it was merely her instinct to draw the line dividing the seen from the unseen higher than they do in towns. It is Bathsheba whom we have seen here, and whose story agrees with his. I shall not tell Bathsheba over again, or do more than remind the reader that she does not marry the good Gabriel Oak till after she has married the unworthy Sergeant Troy, whom her mad lover Boldwood kills, and so releases her to her right destiny with Oak. She is a girl of great good sense as well as beauty, and of that practical turn of mind which goes with prettiness rather oftener than with plainness. She has inherited a farm from her uncle, and having been cheated by her manager, she decides to manage it herself. There is a delightful prospect of this side of Bathsheba's character in the scene which passes between her and the farm servants to whom she makes her purpose known. Half an hour later, Bathsheba, in finished dress, and followed by Liddy, entered the upper end of the old hall, to find that her men had all deposited themselves on a long form and a settle at the lower extremity. She sat down at a table and opened the time book, pen in her hand, with a canvas money bag beside her. From this she poured a small heap of coin. Liddy took up a position at her elbow and began to sew, sometimes pausing and looking round, or with the air of a privileged person, taking up one of the half sovereigns lying before her, and admiringly surveying it as a work of art merely, strictly preventing her countenance from expressing any wish to possess it as money. "Now, before I begin, men," said Bathsheba, "I have two matters to speak of. The first is, that the bailiff is dismissed for thieving, and that I have formed a resolution to have no bailiff at all, but to manage everything with my own head and hands." The men breathed an audible breath of amazement. "Yes, sir, ma'am, I mane," said the person addressed. "I am the personal name of Poorgrass, who is nothing in my own eye. In the eye of other people, well, I don't say it, though public thought will out. What do you do on the farm?" "I does carting things all the year, and in seed time I shoots the rooks and sparrows, and helps at pig killing, sir." "How much to you?" "Please 9 and 9 pence, and a good halfpenny where 'twas a bad one, sir, ma'am, I mane." "Quite correct. Now here are 10 shillings in addition, as a small present, as I am a newcomer." Bathsheba blushed slightly at the sense of being generous in public, and Henry Fray, who had drawn up towards her chair, lifted his eyebrows and fingers to express amazement on a small scale. "How much do I owe you? That man in the corner. What's your name?" continued Bathsheba. "Matthew Moon, ma'am," said a singular framework of clothes, with nothing of any consequence inside them, which advanced with the toes in no definite direction forwards, but turned in or out as they chanced to swing. "Matthew Mark, did you say?" "Speak out, I shall not hurt you," inquired the young farmer, kindly. "Matthew Moon, mem," said Henry Fray, correctingly, from behind her chair, to which point he had edged himself. "Matthew Moon," murmured Bathsheba, turning her bright eyes to the book. 10 and 2 halfpenny is the sum put down to you, I see." "Yes, missus," said Matthew, as the rustle of wind among dead leaves. "Here it is, and 10 shillings. Now the next. Andrew Randall, you are a new man, I hear. How came you to leave your last farm?" "Please, ma'am, please, ma'am, please'm." "Andrew Randall, here's yours. Finish thanking me in a day or two." Now the next. Laban Tall, you'll stay on working for me?" "For you or anybody that pays me well, ma'am," replied the young married man. "True, the man must live," said a woman in the back quarter, who had just entered with clicking pattens. "What woman is that?" Bathsheba asked. "I be his lawful wife," continued the voice, with greater prominence of manner and tone. "Oh, you are," said Bathsheba. "Well, Laban, will you stay on?" "Yes, he'll stay, ma'am," said again the shrill tongue of Laban's lawful wife. The names remaining were called in the same manner. "Now I think I've done with you," said Bathsheba, closing the book and shaking back a stray twine of hair. "No, ma'am." "The new shepherd will want a man under him," suggested Henry Fray, trying to make himself official again by a sideway approach towards her chair. "Oh, he will? Who can he have?" "Young Cain Ball is a very good lad," Henry said, "and Shepherd Oak don't mind his youth," he added, turning with an apologetic smile to the shepherd, who had just appeared on the scene, and was now leaning against the door post with his arms folded. "Oh, I don't mind that," said Gabriel. "How did Cain come by such a name?" asked Bathsheba. "Oh, you see, mem, his poor mother, not being a Scripture read woman, made a mistake at his christening, thinking 'twas Abel killed Cain, and called him Cain, meaning Abel all the time. The parson put it right, but 'twas too late, for the name could never be got rid of in the parish. 'Tis very unfortunate for the boy. Very well, then, Cainy Ball, to be under shepherd. And you quite understand your duties? You, I mean, Gabriel Oak?" "Quite well, I thank you, Miss Everdene," said Shepherd Oak from the door post. "If I don't, I'll inquire." Gabriel was rather staggered by the remarkable coolness of her manner. Certainly nobody without previous information would have dreamt that Oak and the handsome woman before whom he stood had ever been other than strangers. She then rose, but before retiring addressed a few words to them with a pretty dignity, to which her mourning dress added a soberness that was hardly to be found in the words themselves. "Now mind, you have a mistress instead of a master. I don't yet know my powers or my talents in farming, but I shall do my best, and if you serve me well, so shall I serve you. Don't any unfair ones among you, if there are any such, but I hope not, suppose that because I'm a woman I don't understand the difference between bad goings on and good. And so good night, all." "Good night, ma'am." Then this small thesmothete stepped from the table and surged out of the hall, her black silk dress licking up a few straws and dragging them along with a scratching noise upon the floor. Liddy, elevating her feelings to the occasion from a sense of grandeur, floated off behind Bathsheba with a milder dignity, not entirely free from travesty, and the door was closed. This is Bathsheba when her head is at work and her common sense. Another perspective of her when her heart is at work and her uncommon feeling is not edifying, but it is doubtless as faithful. It is that famous scene of Sergeant Troy showing Bathsheba the broadsword exercise. At 8 o'clock this midsummer evening, whilst the bristling ball of gold in the west still swept the tips of the ferns with its long luxuriant rays, a soft brushing by of garments might have been heard among them, and Bathsheba appeared in their midst, their soft feathery arms caressing her up to her shoulders. "Now," said Troy, producing the sword, which, as he raised it into the sunlight, gleamed a sort of greeting like a living thing, "first we have 4 right and 4 left cuts, 4 right and 4 left thrusts. Infantry cuts and guards are more interesting than ours to my mind, but they are not so swashing. They have 7 cuts and 3 thrusts. Now I'll be more interesting, and let you see some loose play, giving all the cuts and points, infantry and cavalry, quicker than lightning, and as promiscuously, with just enough rule to regulate instinct and yet not to fetter it. You are my antagonist, with this difference from real warfare, that I shall miss you every time by 1 hair's breadth, or perhaps 2. Mind you don't flinch, whatever you do." "I'll be sure not to," she said, invincibly. He pointed to about a yard in front of him. Bathsheba's adventurous spirit was beginning to find some grains of relish in these highly novel proceedings. She took up her position as directed, facing Troy. "Now, just to learn whether you have pluck enough to let me do what I wish, I'll give you a preliminary test." He flourished the sword by way of introduction number 2, and the next thing of which she was conscious was that the point and blade of the sword were darting with a gleam towards her left side, just above her hip; then of their reappearance on her right side, having apparently passed through her body. The third item of consciousness was that of seeing the same sword, perfectly clean and free from blood, held vertically in Troy's hand in the position technically called "recover swords." All was as quick as electricity. "Oh!" she cried out in affright, pressing her hand to her side. "Have you run me through?" "No, you have not." "Whatever have you done?" "I have not touched you," said Troy, quietly. "It was mere sleight of hand. The sword passed behind you. Now you are not afraid, are you? Because if you are, I can't perform." "I give my word that I will not only not hurt you, but not once touch you." "I don't think I am afraid." "You are quite sure you will not hurt me?" "Oh, no, only stand as still as a statue." "Now." In an instant the atmosphere was transformed to Bathsheba's eyes. Beams of light, caught from the low sun's rays, above, around, in front of her, well nigh shut out earth and heaven, all emitted in the marvelous evolutions of Troy's reflecting blade, which seemed everywhere at once, and yet nowhere specially. These circling gleams were accompanied by a keen rush that was almost a whistling, also springing from all sides of her at once. In short, she was enclosed in a firmament of light, and of sharp hisses, resembling a skyful of meteors close at hand. It may safely be asserted with respect to the closeness of his cuts, that had it been possible for the edge of the sword to leave in the air a permanent substance wherever it flew past, the space left untouched would have been a complete mould of Bathsheba's figure. The hissing of the sword had ceased, and he stopped entirely. "That outer loose lock of hair wants tidying," he said, before she had moved or spoken. "Wait, I'll do it for you." An arc of silver shone on her right side. The sword had descended, the lock dropped to the ground. "Bravely borne," said Troy. "You didn't flinch a shade's thickness. Wonderful in a woman. It was because I didn't expect it." "Oh, you have spoilt my hair." "Only once more." "No, no, I'm afraid of you. Indeed I am," she cried. "But how could you chop off a curl of my hair with a sword that has no edge?" "No edge? This sword will shave like a razor. Look here." He touched the palm of his hand with the blade, and then lifting it showed her a thin shaving of scarf skin dangling therefrom. II. The first glimpse of Paula Power in the Laodicean suggests a character as vividly as the first glimpse of Bathsheba, and gives us the sense of a heroine as thoroughly Harteesque, though she is of such a different tradition and position. It is not in the cool, sequestered vale of life that Paula Power keeps the tenor of her way, but in the midst of worldly interests and ambitions which beset her as the heiress of a self-made father who has made a great deal of money in the process of making himself. He has left her in possession of De Stancy Castle, where she lives with a daughter of the ancient house as her companion and friend, and in charge of a Baptist chapel which he built and bestowed on the congregation to which he belonged. It is from filial piety, rather than the other sort, that Paula has brought herself to the point of being baptized into this church. For her ecclesiastical affiliations, as a young lady of wealth, culture, and fashion, or potential fashion, would not otherwise have been with this unpicturesque and unworldly sect of dissenters. She is presented to the reader in the moment of attempting to fulfil her pious duty, and I think any reader will agree with me that her introduction is not less spectacular and impressive than that of Bathsheba Everdene, though the circumstances are altogether so different. As in the case of Bathsheba, we share the vision of the heroine with her lover, though now it is no such single nature as the shepherd oak, but the complex personality, not less sincere, of the young architect Somerset that is concerned. Somerset is down from London on a sketching excursion, and has looked into the chapel at the close of a summer's day, because he has happened to hear that there is to be a baptism in that strikingly ugly edifice. He gazed into the lighted chapel, made what had been an evening scene when he looked away from the landscape night itself on looking back. But he could see enough to discover that a brougham had driven up to the side door used by the young water bearers, and that a lady in white and black, half mourning, was in the act of alighting, followed by what appeared to be a waiting woman carrying wraps. They entered the vestry room of the chapel, and the door was shut. The service went on as before, till at a certain moment the door between vestry and chapel was opened, when a woman came out clothed in an ample robe of flowing white, which descended to her feet. She was rather tall than otherwise, and the contour of her head and shoulders denoted a girl in the heyday of youth and activity. His imagination, stimulated by this beginning, set about filling in the meagre outline with most attractive details. She stood upon the brink of the pool, and the minister descended the steps at its edge till the soles of his shoes were moistened with the water. He turned to the young candidate, but she did not follow him. Instead of doing so, she remained rigid as a stone. He stretched out his hand, but she still showed reluctance, till, with some embarrassment, he went back and spoke softly in her ear, afterwards saying in a voice audible to all who were near, "You will descend?" She approached the edge, looked into the water, and gently turned away. Somerset could for the first time see her face. The total dissimilarity between the expression of her lineaments and that of the countenances around her was not a little surprising, and was productive of hypotheses without measure as to how she came there. She was, in fact, emphatically a modern type of maidenhood, and she looked ultra modern by reason of her environment, a presumably sophisticated being among the simple ones. Not wickedly so, but one who knew life fairly well for her age. "And you refuse?" said the astonished minister, as she still stood immovable on the brink of the pool. He added to the force of his pleading by persuasively taking her sleeve between his finger and thumb, as if to draw her. But she resented this by a quick movement of displeasure, and he released her, seeing that he had gone too far. "But, my dear lady," he whispered, "you promised. Consider your profession, and that you stand in the eyes of the whole church as an exemplar of your faith." "I cannot help it," she said, trying to get away. "You came here with the intention to fulfill the word." "But I was mistaken." "Then why did you come?" She tacitly implied that to be a question she did not care to answer. "Please say no more to me. I can wait no longer," she murmured, and hastened to withdraw. But the minister was not without insight, and he had seen that it would be useless to say more. The crestfallen old man had to turn round upon the congregation and declare officially that the baptism was postponed. She passed through the door into the vestry. His face had a severe and even denunciatory look as he gave out his text, and Somerset began to understand that this meant mischief to the person who had caused the hitch. The sermon straightway began and went on, and it was soon apparent that the commentary was to be no less forcible than the text. It was also apparent that the words were virtually not directed forward in the line in which they were uttered, but through the chink of the vestry door, that had stood slightly ajar since the exit of the young lady. At this moment there was not, in the whole chapel, a person whose imagination was not centered on what was invisibly taking place within the vestry door. The thunder of the minister's eloquence echoed, of course, through the sisters' cavern of retreat, no less than round the public assembly. What she was doing inside there, whether listening contritely or haughtily hastening to get away from the chapel and all it contained, was obviously the thought of each member. The sermon ended, the minister wiped his streaming face and turned down his cuffs, and nods and sagacious glances went round. For Somerset there was but one scene, the imagined scene of the girl herself, as she sat alone in the vestry. The fervent congregation rose to sing again, and then Somerset heard a slight noise on his left hand, which caused him to turn his head. The brougham, which had retired into the field to wait, was back again at the door. The subject of his rumination came out from the chapel, not in her mystic robe of white, but dressed in ordinary fashionable costume, followed as before by the attendant, with other articles of clothing on her arm, including the white gown. Somerset fancied that the younger woman was drying her eyes with her handkerchief, but there was not much time to see. They quickly entered the carriage, and it moved on. Then a cat suddenly mewed, and he saw a white Persian standing forlorn where the carriage had been. The door was opened, the cat taken in, and the carriage rolled away. 3. I feel a kind of defeat in my efforts to impart a conception of Mr. Hardy's heroines by the quotation of this or that passage. They live so much more in what they think and feel and say than in what they do, that no scene or incident can do them justice, as a scene or incident might in the case of Charles Reade's heroines, for instance. Many scenes, many incidents in which the Hardy heroine's figure remain vivid in the mind, but if taken from the context, they do not tell the story as one would think. This may happen because the psychological texture of the story is as close and strong as the sociological texture is loose and slight. I have already intimated my sense of the unimportance of this in Mr. Hardy's fiction, as compared with the recognition of the deeper relations of human beings. We scarcely think of his people as of this calling or that station at all after the first moment, and even in making their acquaintance we do not concern ourselves with the part attributed to them in society. We often wholly forget it, though we never lose the sense of their intense reality. If any one will contrast the sense of life imparted by a novel of Trollope, say, with that given by a novel of Mr. Hardy, I believe he will get my meaning. These masters are of the same sincerity and veracity, but Trollope reaches man through society, and Mr. Hardy finds him in nature. There is a great deal of society in the Laodicean. People do things in the forms and customs that constitute the history of everyday life, but through the stream of these little ordinary events pulses the current of poetry and passion, and bears the lovers along in a splendid isolation from the events pressing upon them from all sides. For instance, but like all the other instances this will be imperfect, Paula has been giving a sort of garden party at Dustancy Castle, which Somerset, as her architect, is restoring in parts, and they have been dancing in the marquee with Paula's guests, just before a shower breaks upon it. The dance was over, and he had retired with Paula to the back of the tent, when another faint flash of lightning was visible through an opening. She lifted the canvas and looked out, Somerset looking out behind her. Another dance was begun, and being on this account left out of notice, Somerset did not hasten to leave Paula's side. "I think they begin to feel the heat," she said. A little ventilation would do no harm. He flung back the tent door where he stood, and the light shone out upon the grass. "I must go to the drawing room soon," she added. "They will begin to leave shortly." "It is not late. The thunder cloud has made it seem dark. See there, a line of pale yellow stretches along the horizon from west to north. That's evening. Not gone yet. Shall we go into the fresh air for a minute?" She seemed to signify assent, and he stepped off the tent floor upon the ground. She stepped off also. The air out of doors had not cooled, and without definitely choosing a direction, they found themselves approaching a little wooden tea house that stood on the lawn a few yards off. Arrived here, they turned and regarded the tent they had just left, and listened to the strains that came from within it. "I feel more at ease now," said Paula. "So do I," said Somerset. "I mean," she added in an undeceiving tone, "because I saw Mrs. Goodman enter the tent again just as we came out here, so I have no further responsibility." "I meant something quite different. Try to guess what." She teasingly demurred, finally breaking the silence by saying, "The rain has come at last," as great drops began to fall upon the ground with a smack like pellets of clay. In a moment the storm poured down with sudden violence, and they drew further back into the summer house. The side of the tent from which they had emerged still remained open, the rain streaming down between their eyes, and the lighted interior of the marquee like a tissue of glass threads, the brilliant forms of the dancers passing and repassing behind the watery screen, as if they were people in an enchanted submarine palace. "How happy they are," said Paula. "They don't even know that it is raining. I'm so glad that my aunt had the tent lined, otherwise such a downpour would have gone clean through it." The thunderstorm showed no symptoms of abatement, and the music and dancing went on more merrily than ever. "We cannot go in," said Somerset, "and we cannot shout for umbrellas. We will stay here till it is over, will we not?" "Yes," she said, "if you care to." "Ah! What is it?" Only a big drop came upon my head. Let us stand further in." Her hand was hanging by her side, and Somerset's was close by. He took it, and she did not draw it away. Thus they stood a long while, the rain hissing down upon the grass plot, and not a soul being visible outside the dancing tent save themselves. "May I call you Paula?" asked he. "Yes, occasionally," she murmured. "Dear Paula, may I call you that?" "Oh, no, not yet." "But you know I love you," he insisted. "I can give a shrewd guess," she said slyly. "And shall I love you always?" "If you wish to." "And will you love me?" Paula did not reply. "Will you, Paula?" he repeated. "You may love me, but don't you love me in return?" "I love you to love me." "Won't you say anything more explicit?" "Not a single word." Somerset emitted half a sigh. He wished he had been more demonstrative, yet felt that this passive way of assenting was as much as he could hope for. Had there been anything cold in her passivity, he might have felt repressed. But her stillness suggested the stillness of motion, imperceptible from its intensity. "We must go in," said she. "The rain is almost over, and there is no longer any excuse for this." Somerset bent his lips towards hers. "No," said the fair Puritan decisively. "Why not?" he asked. "Nobody ever has." "But," expostulated Somerset, "to everything there is a season, and the season for this is not just now," she answered, walking away. 4. Yes, this instance, like all the others, is imperfect and inadequate to the message it is meant to bear in my criticism, and I have to blame myself for letting a subordinate book so largely represent the very great and singular artist I have attempted to deal with. He has reached the height of his power, I think, in his tremendous novel, Jude the Obscure, where fate, so humorous, and at the worst ironical in so many of his stories, turns luridly tragical. No greater and truer book has been written in our time, or any. And yet Jude, if it were to be quoted from significantly, is not to be quoted from in this company at all, without risk to the critic of sharing the misunderstanding which befell the author. It may be safely said, however, or at any rate it shall be ventured, that in Jude, and in the morbid, half-crazed endeavour of the heroine to atone by her own sacrifice for the cursed spite of conditions, the novelist makes an offering at the shrine of the womanly which ought to appease that deity, if ever it has been offended, by a sense of slight or mocking in his adoration. It is not a book which could harm innocence. Evil itself cannot harm innocence. But certainly it is not a book for inexperience. For experience, however, it is full of wisdom, and for the heart and mind open to the fearful implications of such a history and temperament as Sue Broadhead's, it has problems of tremendous appeal. It would be worthy the study of experience, if for nothing else than as the work of a talent there eventuating in its ultimate seriousness. End of Section 33. Section 34 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. William Black's Gertrude White. In my sense of at least partial defeat by the heroines of Mr. Harte, who have suffered me to represent them mainly in some of their lighter moments, I am sufficiently humiliated to make a confession that I would rather not have made. I confess that I never read a novel of Blackmore's, or a novel of Stevenson's, or more than one novel of Mr. George Meredith's. And though I might qualify myself to speak of their heroines by taking a course of their fiction, I am afraid that my appreciation would have a perfunctory look out of keeping with the prevailing complexion of these studies. I might learn what those ladies were like, but I should have no associations with them from the past, no remembered passion, and if it is not now too late with me to form a passion for a new heroine, it would not be perhaps becoming. 1. In the case of Stevenson, I am hardly a great loser, I fancy, unless I am wrong in supposing his romances are mostly stories of adventure, such as the heroine does not best develop in. As I have before intimated, she cannot make her peculiar powers felt in the highest degree by the hero who is saving her life or defending her honor. She requires the safety and quiet of normal conditions for the last effect of her charm, which is the translation of everyday life into a supernal ecstasy. I dare say I could not make so good my defence in the case of Blackmore, for Lorna Doone is a heroine whose adorers simply troop at her heels. I can only regret that I have not her acquaintance, and sigh that it seems too late to make it. As for Mr. George Meredith's heroines, my experience is confined to such of them as may be met in Beauchamp's career, and from that I have no recollection of them by name. I was barely 50 when I read the book, but one begins to forget names so early. I do, however, have the impression that they talked a great deal, as Mr. Meredith writes, though they shared this foible with all the other characters, and I could not greatly blame them, since his writing gave me the sense of a singularly powerful mind and generous spirit. I thought Beauchamp's career a magnificent piece of intellectuation, fused through and through by electrical emotion, but I could not get farther with the author, though I tried one novel of his after another, as one votary of his after another solemnly promised me conversion in the interest of my soul's salvation. I remained, and I still remain, unable to reconcile my aesthetics with his, though I uncover to his ethics as I know them in Beauchamp's career. He appears to me a powerful, wilful talent, who could have flourished into critical acceptance as a novelist only in an atmosphere of such aesthetic anarchy as wraps the British Isles, but he may some day appear differently to me through my greater knowledge of him. This has happened to me with Mr. George Moore, whom I long shied off from, because I fancied him doing over again, from the realistic formula, the work of Monsieur Zola. Monsieur Zola seemed doing it so fully that I thought myself in no need of Mr. George Moore. But his Esther Waters showed me how mistaken I was. That is a great book, and if it had not appeared in an age which has been spoiled by great fictions, it would have been prized as one of the greatest. I know that it won celebrity of even the popular sort, and that it received critical recognition, but it has not achieved the lasting credit which is its due. Its very merits forbid me to study it here, for the sad, plain, naked truth about life is apt to shock, or to make people think they are shocked, and in its facts it is sometimes outside of those decorums of Anglo-Saxon fiction which I have been treating as the decencies. So is the very powerful group of studies which the author calls the celibates, and which the mere name of brings back my strong emotion in reading them. The three differing types of the womanly presented there are of that novelty and reality in which life abounds, but which we suppose exhausted because fiction, like history, so commonly repeats itself. Mr. Moore's fiction is not like history in this, and it is probably more like Memoire pour survivre than like history in its way of dealing with the unupholstered human soul. But I am aware that the upholstered soul is more presentable to mixed companies, especially when there are young people present, and so I leave this author's heroines out of my series, though I cannot leave them out of my mind, and I wish to make my manners to what I think their prodigious veracity. 2. There is no such embarrassment as I have here hastened to escape in dealing with the heroines of William Black, who are quite of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. They are nice girls, even when they are naughty, as some of them are, or at least they do not misbehave beyond the bounds of convention. They flirt, but unless flirtation is a sin, they do not sin, and they are not sinned against very direly. They began rather simply and naturally in the course of a journey in a phaeton, whose strange adventures once pleased so greatly, and they almost ended, and rather insipidly, in the voyage of a houseboat. The two novels indicated will occur to most readers whose novel reading extended from 1870 to 1890.
but in the interval there were other novels of Black's, which signalized his deeper knowledge of human and of woman nature, and his growing dramatic power. This power was apt at times to disperse itself in the sobs and tears of hysterical emotion, but there is no doubt that, short of such climaxes, it was a power. It relaxed rather too often in the description of natural scenery, and killed too many salmon, and quoted too much Gaelic, but still it was power. In such a story as Madcap Violet, it triumphed in character, then new to fiction, and of interesting actuality in life; and in Macleod of Dare it went deeper, and came up with stronger contrasts to truly tragical purpose. Macleod of Dare seems to have been the highest as well as deepest reach of the author's art. For after it he continued to repeat himself with varying effect, and returned ultimately to that earlier method and manner which won him his public. It was never the best public, never the most critical, and yet his work had friends of the most critical instincts and the most fastidious tastes, who accepted him with reservation, but without patronage. A sense of his innate manliness forbade that, and upon the whole he enjoyed, while he lived, a dignified popularity which, since his death, has not quite become fame. Yet his work is so very much better than that of novelists who, in a time of inferior fiction, did achieve remembrance, that one resents for him the sort of unjust neglect which it has fallen into. It was his fate or his accident to begin writing naturalistic fiction of the old-fashioned English kind, and to establish himself as a lover of real life just before the violent campaign for naturalism began on the Continent, where almost nothing that was nice, and almost everything that was nasty, was accounted natural. He continued writing in his own way amidst the impassioned struggle against romanticism in France, Spain, and Italy, and remained no more affected by the polemics of M. Zola than by the perfection of Flaubert or Maupassant. The great, the matchless fiction of Russia did not move him from his course, and his constant English public stood by him, while the more fitful favor of his American friends did not always fail him. He saw the fall of the Dickens worship and the rise of the Thackeray doubt. Trollope outlived himself, and George Eliot died after the distinct decline of her too deeply ethicized art, and there was a moment when William Black might have been recognized as the leading writer of English fiction, unless we are to count some novelists of finer skill and greater force in the American condition of English fiction. But, unhappily for his supremacy, the vaster and deeper and fresher naturalism of Mr. Thomas Hardy began to make itself known, and William Black's chance was gone. There was no later chance, and he was left to end his career to the strains of the muted second violin, which form the saddest music in the world to the performer's ear. 3. No writers could be more opposite in their realism than the novelists whom I have just named, and Black. Both are poets, and both are apt to seek in nature the charm they make us feel, but the final sense of the mystery and loveliness imparted by Mr. Hardy is of something which his heroine confers upon her circumstance, and in Black's fiction it seems something which she derives from it. I am now thinking chiefly of such a girl as Gertrude White in Macleod of Dare, who is as dependent upon society for means of self-expression as any heroine I know, and yet is as genuine a personality as may be met in fiction. She was recognized with an art which was perhaps at its best in her portrayal, and she had a freshness which is now gone from her type. She belongs to that social moment, since satirized beyond recall, when aesthetics began to be so generally received into society, that society seemed to have become aesthetical. In that instant of fine confusion, the stage especially went into society so much, that it might well appear that society had gone upon the stage; and a brilliant and beautiful young actress like Gertrude White, meeting Sir Keith Macleod at a fashionable house, would never have suggested a theatre to the young Highlander dropped down in London from his native isles. "But you have seen our elm, our own elm?" said Mrs. Ross, who was arranging some azaleas that had just been sent her. "We are very proud of our elm. Gertrude, will you take Sir Keith to see our noble elm?" He had almost forgotten who Gertrude was, but the next second he recognised the low and almost timid voice that said, "Will you come this way, then, Sir Keith?" He turned and found that it was Miss White who spoke. How was it that this girl, who was only a girl, seemed to do things so easily and gently and naturally, without any trace of embarrassment or self-consciousness? He followed her, and knew not which to admire the more, the careless simplicity of her manner, or the singular symmetry of her tall and slender figure. He had never seen any statue or any picture in any book to be compared with this woman, who was so fine and rare and delicate that she seemed only a beautiful tall flower in this garden of flowers. There was a strange simplicity, too, about her dress, a plain, tight fitting, tight sleeved dress of unrelieved black, her only adornment being some bands of big blue beads worn loosely round the neck. The black figure in this shimmer of rose pink and gold and flowers was effective enough, but even the finest of pictures or the finest of statues has not the subtle attraction of a graceful carriage. But Cloud had never seen any woman walk as this woman walked, in so stately and yet so simple a way. From Mrs. Ross's chief drawing room they passed into an ante drawing room, which was partly a passage and partly a conservatory. On the window side were some rows of Cape heaths. "Look at this beautiful heath. Mrs. Ross is very proud of her heaths." The small white fingers scarcely touched the beautiful blossoms of the plant, but which were the more palely roseate and waxen. If one were to grasp that hand in some sudden moment of entreaty, in the sharp joy of reconciliation, in the agony of farewell, would it not be crushed like a frail flower? "This is our elm," said she, lightly. "Mrs. Ross and I regard it as our own. We have sketched it so often." They had emerged from the conservatory into a small square room, which was practically a continuation of the drawing room, but which was decorated in pale blue and silver, and filled with a lot of knick-knacks that showed it was doubtless Mrs. Ross's boudoir. And out there, in the clear June sunshine, lay the broad green sward behind Prince's Gate, with the one splendid elm spreading its broad branches into the blue sky, and throwing a soft shadow on the corner of the gardens next to the house. How sweet and still it was, as still as the calm, clear light in this girl's eyes. There was no passion there, and no trouble, only the light of a June day, and of blue skies, and a peaceful soul. She rested the tips of her fingers on a small rosewood table that stood by the window. Surely, if a spirit ever lived in any table, the wood of this table must have thrilled to its core. But Cloud, in his dreaming, did not dream her an actress, but because her very life was an art, she was not less acting now than she was the night of the same day when he saw her on the stage, in a comedy which had been a very stupid, conventional play, till she appeared. Suddenly his heart seemed to stand still altogether. It was a light, glad laugh, the sound of a voice he knew, that seemed to have pierced him as with a rifle ball. And at the same moment, from the green shimmer of foliage in the balcony, there stepped into the glare of the hall a young girl with life and laughter, and a merry carelessness in her face and eyes. She threw her arm around her mother's neck and kissed her. She bowed to the legal person. She flung her garden hat on to a couch, and got up on a chair to get fresh seed put in for her canary. It was all done so simply and naturally and gracefully that in an instant a fire of life and reality sprang into the whole of this sham thing. The woman was no longer a marionette, but the anguish-stricken mother of this gay and heedless girl. And when the daughter jumped down from the chair again, her canary on her finger, and when she came forward to pet and caress and remonstrate with her mother, and when the glare of the lights flashed on the merry eyes and on the white teeth and laughing lips, there was no longer any doubt possible. But Cloud's face was quite pale. He took the programme from Ogilvy's hand, and for a minute or two stared mechanically at the name of Miss Gertrude White printed on the pink-tinted paper. Again she is acting, but neither more nor less consciously, when McLeod comes to luncheon, and she makes the maid give her the salad to dress, while the keen eyes of her young sister divine her and deride her. "There is no use making any pretence," said she, sharply. "You know quite well why you are making that salad dressing." "Did you never see me make salad dressing before?" said the other, quite as sharply. "You know it is simply because Sir Keith McLeod is coming to lunch." "I forgot all about it. Oh, and that's why you had the clean curtains put up yesterday?" What else had this precocious brain ferreted out? "Yes, and that's why you bought papa a new necktie," continued the tormentor, and then she added triumphantly, "but he hasn't put it on this morning. Ha, Gerty?" A calm and dignified silence is the best answer to the fiendishness of 13. Miss White went on with the making of the salad dressing. She was considered very clever at it. A smart young maidservant, very trimly dressed, made her appearance. "Sir Keith McLeod, miss," said she. "Oh, Gerty, you're caught," muttered the fiend. But Miss White was equal to the occasion. The small white fingers plied the fork without a tremor. "Ask him to step this way, please," she said, and then the subtle imagination of this demon of 13 jumped to another conclusion. "Oh, Gerty, you want to show him that you are a good housekeeper, that you can make salad." For it will be remembered that McLeod is instantly in love with Gertrude, and has no thought but of marrying her and making her leave the stage. He has found her in society, intellectually inferior to her, of course, but rich and refined, and delicately appreciative of such bric a brac as she. And though he is a splendid young fellow, with generous possibilities of lifelong adoration for the woman he loves, he has no conception of the sacrifice she must make in giving up her career to be the wife of a Highland chieftain on the wild Scottish shore. She has no conception of it either, when she promises. Her selfish old father, the collector of other bric a brac than she, does not like the match, and consents unwillingly that she shall leave the life for which he has had her so carefully trained, and in which her success has so far been so brilliant. "I will beg you to remember, Gerty," he remarked with some dignity, "that I did not make you an actress, if that is what you imply. If it had not been entirely your own wish, I should never have encouraged you. And I think it shows great ingratitude, not only to me, but to the public also, that when you have succeeded in obtaining a position such as any woman in the country might envy, you treat your good fortune with indifference, and show nothing but discontent. I cannot tell what has come over you of late. You ought certainly to be the last to say anything against a profession that has gained for you such a large share of public favour." "Public favour!" she said, with a bitter laugh. "Who is the favourite of the public in this very town?" "Why, the girl that plays in that farce, who smokes a cigarette, and walks round the stage like a man, and dances a breakdown. Why, wasn't I taught to dance breakdowns?" Here once more, doubtless, the girl is unconsciously acting, and it is not till she has seen McLeod on his native heath, and among the clansmen to whom he is a demigod, in a semi feudal, almost semi barbarous environment, that she is fully awakened to the reality. She sees no beauty or grandeur in the life to which his love destines her as remorselessly as if it were hate, and she finds that she cannot give up all that she has made herself in the world that seems to her great and worth winning. She begins to pull at the leash which binds her, and when she gets back to London she breaks with McLeod. Then he ventures upon that wild, that mad scheme of luring her aboard his yacht, and carrying her off to the Highlands to make her his wife against her will, but not, as he believes, against her love. "You cannot go ashore, Gertrude," he repeated. "We have already left Erith. Gerty, Gerty," he continued, for she was struck dumb with a sudden terror, "don't you understand now? I have stolen you away from yourself. There was but the one thing left, the one way of saving you, and you will forgive me, Gerty, when you understand it all." She was gradually recovering from her terror. She did understand it now, and he was not ill at all. "Oh, you coward, you coward, you coward!" she exclaimed with a blaze of fury in her eyes. And I was to confer a kindness on you, a last kindness. But you dare not do this thing. I tell you, you dare not do it. I demand to be put on shore at once. Do you hear me?" She turned wildly round as if to seek for some way to escape. The door of the ladies' cabin stood open. The daylight was streaming down into that cheerful little place. There were some flowers on the dressing table, but the way by which she had descended was barred over and dark. She faced him again, and her eyes were full of fierce indignation and anger. She drew herself up to her full height. She overwhelmed him with taunts and reproaches and scorn. That was a splendid piece of acting, seeing that it had never been rehearsed. He stood unmoved before all this theatrical rage. "Oh, yes, you were proud of your name," she was saying with bitter emphasis, "and I thought you belonged to a race of gentlemen to whom lying was unknown, and you were no longer murderous and revengeful. But you can take your revenge on a woman for all that. And you asked me to come and see you because you are ill, and you have laid a trap like a coward. And if I am what you say, Gertie," said he quite gently, "it is the love of you that has made me that." "Oh, you do not know." She saw nothing of the lines that pain had written on this man's face. She recognized nothing of the very majesty of grief in the hopeless eyes. He was only her jailer, her enemy. Of course," said she. "It is the woman. It is always the woman who is in fault. That is a manly thing, to put the blame on the woman. And it is a manly thing to take your revenge on a woman. I thought when a man had a rival that it was his rival whom he sought out. But you kept out of the way." He strode forward and caught her by the wrist. There was a look in his face that for a second terrified her into silence. "Gertie," said he, "I warn you, do not mention that man to me, now or at any time, or it will be bad for him and you." She twisted her hand from his grasp. "How dare you come near me?" she cried. "As is well known, the yacht is wrecked, and they are drowned together, and there is an implication that somehow McLeod is a fine fellow, and that Gertrude White is not a good girl, and has met a merited fate. But I do not know why she is not a good girl. The charge against her, so far as it is made out, is brought by her sister Carrie, who accuses her of flirting with McLeod. She certainly did nothing to prevent his loving her, no doubt because she was in love with him. But when she found that his love demanded more of her than she could give, she did nothing worse than try to break her engagement. Under the circumstances, that was the best thing to do, and if she wished to break it gently and not roughly, that was not proof of a bad heart in her, but a good one. She had the histrionic nature, but that is not necessarily an insincere nature, though it means the dangerous power of self-deception. Imaginably, the subjective process of Gertrude White's tragedy was the capacity of being charmed by what was new and picturesque in McLeod, and of not being sufficiently repelled by his latent race savagery, which she latently feared. She could figure the world, and the mimic world, well lost for love with him, on the barren crag to which he invited her at the cost of all she had hitherto held dear. But when she saw the barren crag, she would over realize the immense sacrifice demanded of her, and her recoil would be the imperative mandate of what was the law of her being. She could not change that law, which was not an evil law, though it set the artist instinct against the woman instinct. And the lesson of her experience is not that you must not be an artist if you are a woman, but that if you are a man in love with that kind of woman, you must count upon her duplex instinct, which is by no means duplicity. If you offer her the fulfillment of one instinct, you must leave her to fulfill the other, and to demand its extirpation is stupid as well as cruel. McLeod of Dare was both stupid and cruel, though he was so fine and generous and brave. If we consider the story of his love tragedy as something that simply happened through the war of his temperament with that of the woman he loved, then it is a great tragedy of the quality of the Greek destiny play. But if we regard it as a morality, it is weak and foolish unless it teaches that McLeod was wrong and Gertrude was right. It is enough for a man to ask that a woman shall merge her woman life in his, and more than most men can fully justify in marriage, but that she shall lose her artist life, too, is asking something monstrous. Whenever they talk of this sacrifice which McLeod requires, the girl tries tenderly to make him understand how vital the sacrifice is, but she cannot. He remains the true, simple, masterful soul who thinks he is asking something wholly fit and proper for a husband to ask. We have no hint of the author's feeling, except so far as it may appear in his obvious fondness for MacLeod, and his willingness to depreciate Gertrude White. He does not weaken so far as to use Thackeray's ironical method with her, though he applies it now and then to her sarcastic little sister, but he loses the greater opportunity in the less when he rejects the subjective for the objective tragedy. It wrings the reader's heart to have the heroine die with her lover, but it would be better than heartbreak for him if he could realize her living with a husband for whom she had given up too much. That would set him thinking, and though a reader does not like to think, it is often the best thing he can do. To feel is comparatively cheap and easy. End of section 34.
Section 35 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Bret Harte's Miggles and Mr. T.B. Aldrich's Marjorie Daw. So far in these explorations of Anglo-Saxon fiction, we have come upon only 3 American novelists, apparently, whose heroines may match with those of the English novelists. Such a fact may be accounted for upon a theory wounding to our patriotism, if we like the pain, or it may be more gratifyingly explained upon the ground that during the past century the English novelists have probably outnumbered ours quite in the proportion of their representation here. Besides, the heroine is a flower of slow growth, which thrives best in a temperate air and a soil mellowed by long cultivation. Our heroines, compared with the English, are wilding offshoots of a sylvan sweetness and grace, and a fresh loveliness at their best, and at their second best, such as actual women are, much too good for men, no doubt, but not such as are easily gathered in this sort of florist's window. They are scattered widely in 1,000 short stories all over the North, East, South, and West, and the research that would give a just notion of their quantitative fascination would form a complete study of that branch of our fiction. 1. The difficulty of presenting the short story heroine will be realized by the faithful reader of Miss Sarah O. Jewett's exquisite tales and sketches, to name a single and supreme example. In the case of the more objective heroines of such a writer as Bret Harte, one recalls out of the whole number of his more conventionalized types his Miggles, who belongs rather with the edifying Magdalens of the mining communities than with the sinuous and Ophidian group of his politer ladies, too recognizably descended from the heroines of Charles Reade. Neither sort forms the forte of a writer who stamped his peculiar literary personality upon the fancy of his generation so vigorously, and who still keeps so large a public faithful to him. He is at his strongest with his men, and of his 2 kinds of women, his Miggles seems, at least in this retrospect, his prime invention. It will be remembered by my elder readers, at least, how the storm-bound passengers of Yuba Bill's mountain stage take refuge in her wayside cabin during her absence, and before her return have a dull quarter of an hour there in the company of the speechless paralytic, to whom Miggles is dedicating the afternoon of her life, because he has helped her pass the forenoon more gaily, if not so exemplarily, and has, as she says in her brief explanation, spent a heap of money on her. Bill had scarcely ceased growling before we heard a quick step upon the porch. the trailing of a wet skirt, the door was flung open, and with a flash of white teeth, a sparkle of dark eyes, and an utter absence of ceremony or diffidence, a young woman entered, shut the door, and, panting, leaned back against it. "Oh, if you please, I'm Miggles." And this was Miggles, this bright–eyed, full–throated young woman, whose wet gown of coarse blue stuff could not hide the beauty of the feminine curves to which it clung, from the chestnut crown of whose head, topped by a man's oilskin sou'wester, to the little feet and ankles, hidden somewhere in the recesses of her boy's brogans, all was grace. This was Miggles, laughing at us too, in the most airy, frank, off–hand manner imaginable. "You see, boys," said she, quite out of breath, and holding one little hand against her side, quite unheeding the speechless discomfiture of our party, or the complete demoralization of Yuba Bill, whose features had relaxed into an expression of gratuitous and imbecile cheerfulness, "you see, boys, I was more'n 2 miles away when you passed down the road. I thought you might pull up here, and so I ran the whole way, knowing nobody was home but Jim, and I'm out of breath, and that lets me out." And here Miggles caught her dripping oilskin hat from her head with a mischievous swirl that scattered a shower of raindrops over us, attempted to put back her hair, dropped 2 hairpins in the attempt, laughed, and sat down beside Yuba Bill, with her hands crossed lightly on her lap. The judge recovered himself first, and essayed an extravagant compliment. "I'll trouble you for that hairpin," said Miggles gravely. Half a dozen hands were eagerly stretched forward. The missing hairpin was restored to its fair owner, and Miggles, crossing the room, looked keenly in the face of the invalid. The solemn eyes looked back at hers with an expression we had never seen before. Life and intelligence seemed to struggle back into the rugged face. Miggles laughed again. It was a singularly eloquent laugh, and turned her black eyes and white teeth once more towards us. "This inflicted person is," hesitated the judge. "Jim," said Miggles, "your father?" "No, brother." "No, husband?" Miggles darted a quick, half defiant glance at the 2 lady passengers, who, I had noticed, did not participate in the general masculine admiration of Miggles, and said gravely, "No, it's Jim." There was an awkward pause. The lady passengers moved closer to each other. The Washoe husband looked abstractedly at the fire, and the tall man apparently turned his eyes inward for self–support at this emergency. But Miggles's laugh, which was very infectious, broke the silence. "Come," she said briskly, "you must be hungry. Who'll bear a hand to help me get tea?" The literary epoch of Miggles is early traceable in certain little touches. She is of that romanticistic generation which Mr. Harte himself has never outlived, and which we would hardly have him outlive. In her time good criminals abounded, and ladies with pasts were of a present behaviour so self–devoted that they could often put their unerring sisters to the blush. They are rarer now, and even on the stage their histories seem rather more to characterize them, but one likes to believe that there are Miggleses in the world, and life is often so illogical that it is not impossible. It is a case which we have to suppose, but we cannot complain of the terms in which Mr. Harte asks us to suppose it. They are amusing and they are touching, and according to the simple ethics of the period, they are even improving. When it comes time for Miggles's involuntary and unexpected guests to seek such rest as they may find under her roof, she shows the ladies into the one other room, which imaginably their propriety makes too hot for their hostess. At any rate, she soon reappears in the midst of an animated debate concerning her history among the men; but not apparently the same Miggles who, a few hours before, had flashed upon us. Her eyes were downcast, and as she hesitated for a moment on the threshold, with a blanket on her arm, she seemed to have left behind her the frank fearlessness which had charmed us a moment before. Coming into the room, she drew a low stool beside the paralytic's chair, sat down, drew the blanket over her shoulders, and saying, "If it's all the same to you, boys, as we're rather crowded, I'll stop here to night," took the invalid's withered hand in her own, and turned her eyes upon the dying fire. An instinctive feeling that this was only premonitory to more confidential relations, and perhaps some shame at our previous curiosity, kept us silent. The rain still beat upon the roof. Wandering gusts of wind stirred the embers into momentary brightness, until, in a lull of the elements, Miggles suddenly lifted up her head, and throwing her hair over her shoulder, turned her face upon the group, and asked, "Is there any of you that knows me?" There was no reply. "Think again. I lived at Marysville in '53. Everybody knew me there, and everybody had the right to know me. I kept the Polka Saloon until I came to live with Jim. That's 6 years ago. Perhaps I've changed some." The absence of recognition may have disconcerted her. She turned her head to the fire again, and it was some seconds before she again spoke, and then more rapidly. "Well, you see, I thought some of you must have known me. There's no great harm done, anyway. What I was going to say was this. Jim here," she took his hand in both of hers as she spoke, "used to know me, if you didn't, and spent a heap of money upon me. I reckon he spent all he had. And one day, it's 6 years ago this winter, Jim came into my back room, sat down on my sofy, like as you see him in that chair, and never moved again without help. He was struck all of a heap, and never seemed to know what ailed him. The doctors came, and said as how it was caused all along of his way of life, for Jim was mighty free and wild like, and that he would never get better, and couldn't last long anyway. They advised me to send him to Frisco to the hospital, for he was no good to any one, and would be a baby all his life. Perhaps it was something in Jim's eye. Perhaps it was that I never had a baby. But I said no. I was rich then, for I was popular with everybody. Gentlemen like yourself, sir, came to see me. And I sold out my business and bought this yere place, because it was sort of out of the way of travel, you see. And I brought my baby here." With a woman's intuitive tact and poetry, she had, as she spoke, slowly shifted her position so as to bring the mute figure of the ruined man between her and her audience, hiding in the shadow behind it, as if she offered it as a tacit apology for her actions. Hidden in the darkness, but still holding his hand, she went on. "The folks about here are very kind," said Miggles, after a pause, coming a little into the light again. "The men from the Fork used to hang around here until they found they wasn't wanted, and the women are kind and don't call." "And Jim here," said Miggles, with her old laugh again, and coming quite out into the firelight. "Jim, why, boys, you would admire to see how much he knows for a man like him. Sometimes I bring him flowers, and he looks at 'em just as natural as if he knew 'em, and times, when we're sitting alone, I read him those things on the wall. Why, Lord," said Miggles, with her frank laugh, "I've read him that whole side of the house this winter. There never was such a man for reading as Jim." "Why," asked the judge, "do you not marry this man to whom you have devoted your youthful life?" "Well, you see," said Miggles, "it would be playing it rather low down on Jim to take advantage of his being so helpless. And then, too, if we were man and wife now, we'd both know that I was bound to do what I do now of my own accord." "But you are young yet, and attractive." "It's getting late," said Miggles, gravely, "and you'd better all turn in. Good night, boys." And throwing the blanket over her head, Miggles laid herself down beside Jim's chair, her head pillowed on the low stool that held his feet, and spoke no more. The fire slowly faded from the hearth. We each sought our blankets in silence, and presently there was no sound in the long room but the pattering of the rain upon the roof and the heavy breathing of the sleepers. II. Of course, in a certain way, no heroine has ever been. The whole entrancing race exists only by an agreement between author and reader, and if the personality imagined is pleasing, the author may make his own terms with the reader. But he had better not push the reader too far. The reader's credulity is great, but it is possible to exhaust it, and for that reason many heroines of the past, who were impossibly or exorbitantly conditioned, have ceased to be. They were of a fashion or of a mood of feeling, and the fashion or the mood has changed. Once we accepted such heroines as Miggles because they were the fashion, but now we can accept them no longer because they are not the fashion. The great matter for the author who will have his heroine last in the reader's fancy is to condition her so that to any mood she shall be easily imaginable, and one has not to recur to some outworn humor in order to imagine her. Then he may tell us what he will of her. He may say not only that she no longer lives, but that she never lived. Still we rehabilitate her, and she lives on. Mr. T. B. Aldrich went to this length in the case of his Marjorie Daw. She, so far as I know, is the only heroine in the whole range of fiction who perishes under the hand of her creator. Yet she does not pass, but continues vividly present in the reader's consciousness. The first effect of the brilliant sketch in which she has her being is that of irreparable loss. But this is not the last effect. One has a personal grief in learning that Marjorie Daw never existed save in the fancy of the fancied narrator. She does not survive in that tacit make believe of author and reader which is the convention of fiction. She is destroyed, yet she persists, and haunts the memory with an immortal loveliness. Sometimes in the morning, and oftener in the afternoon, when the sun has withdrawn from that part of the mansion, a young woman appears on the piazza with some Penelope web of embroidery in her hand, or a book. There is a hammock over there, of pineapple fibre, it looks from here. A hammock is very becoming when one is 18 and has golden hair and dark eyes and an emerald-colored illusion dress looped up after the fashion of a Dresden china shepherdess, and is chaussee like a belle of the time of Louis XIV. All this splendor goes into that hammock and sways there like a pond lily in the golden afternoon. The girl is invented, it will be remembered, out of the air, to amuse the intolerable leisure of a young fellow laid up with a broken leg, and the friend who invents her becomes gradually so interested in her characterization and the sick man's infatuation with her that he constructs a personality quite as appreciable to the reader. She swings in the hammock and reads. She plays croquet. She listens sympathetically to her friend's accounts of the invalid. She surprises herself in a dawning passion for the sufferer. And then she is locked up by her irascible old father. It is at this point that John Fleming, having impatiently reduced the correspondence with Edward Delany from letters to telegrams, bursts all restraints, and flies to the supposed habitat of the heroine, to find that there is no such heroine, no such house, and no such hammock as Edward Delany's two creative powers have invented. It is a bewitching little romance, almost of the miniature dimensions of a conceit, but it is as filling to the reader as most long novels, and is of an abiding flavor, piquant beyond that of any but a very few. In fact, Marjorie Daw, who by the remorseful confession of her supposed inventor has never lived, has outlived myriads of heroines whose reality has never been impeached by their authors. End of Section 35. Section 36 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. G. W. Cable's Aurora and Clotilde Nancanoe. The heroines of Mr. Cable's admirable novel, The Grandissimes, could be proved, at least to the satisfaction of their present elderly adorer, easily first among the imaginary ladies with whose sweetness novelists have enriched and enlarged our acquaintance. But I should feel that I had neglected a prior claim, if before speaking of them I did not pay my duty to the type of heroine who illumines with her pale wild rose beauty the sylvan scenes of Miss Murfree's mountain stories, and who is fully developed while the pseudonym of Charles Egbert Craddock still veiled the identity of the author. It is a type varied according to circumstance into this character and that, but primarily a type and not a character, and so no doubt more responsive to the social and personal facts from which it was evolved. A sad, shy, almost elusive presence in the savage rudeness of the environment. Sometimes a daughter, sometimes a young wife, sometimes a sweetheart, this heroine is always the same temperamentally, with a sort of martyr grace and angelic innocence that touch the heart to pity rather than passion, and keep the memory constant to an ideal of womanhood as true and beautiful as any conceived in fiction. Whatever the fortune of the author's work shall be, no critic can hereafter recur to the art of her time and not feel the importance of her contribution to it in this type, if in nothing else. After the conditions shall have long passed away, it will remain to testify of the conditions, for it could have been possible only in them, and could have evolved its wistful loveliness only among their contrasts. 1. I am not going to urge the right of Mr. Cable to lead the Southern writers who have done such notable work in fiction since the Civil War. There may very well be two opinions as to that, and it is quite sufficient for my purpose here that the reader should agree with me concerning the positive excellence of the Grandissimes. That seems to me one of the few American fictions which one can think of without feeling the need of forbearance, or without wishing, in the interest of common honesty, strongly to qualify one's praises of it. Ample, yet shapely, picturesque in time and place, but essentially faithful to the facts of both, romantic in character but realistic in characterization, it abounds in varieties and contrasts of life, mellowed but not blurred in the past to which they are attributed. Without accusing the author of slighting any of the rich possibilities of such an historic moment as that of the cession of Louisiana to the United States by France, and the union of the old province with the new nation against the prejudices of nearly all the native population, one may note that the political situation is subordinated to the social and personal interests, and the dark presence of slavery itself is perceptible, not in any studied attitude, but in the casual effects of character among the Creole masters and the Creole slaves. It is well known that the author's presentation of this character dissatisfied, to use a word of negative import for the expression of a positive resentment, the descendants of the Creole masters at least, who fancied their race caricatured in the picture. But the fact only testified to the outside spectator of the extreme difficulty, the impossibility, indeed, of satisfying any people with any portraiture by an alien hand. To such a spectator, Mr. Cable's studies of Creole character in his New Orleans of the early 19th century seem affectionately, almost fondly appreciative, and they convince of their justice by that internal evidence which it is as hard to corroborate as to overthrow. No dearer or delightfuller figures have been presented by the observer of an alien race and religion than Mr. Cable has offered in Aurora and Clotilde Nancanoe, and in none does the artist seem to have penetrated more sympathetically the civilization, so unlike his own, which animated them with a witchery so diverse yet so equal. Without blaming his Creole critics, one wonders what would have satisfied them if they are not content with the vivid and lawless caprice of Aurora, the demure, conscientious, protesting fascination of Clotilde. In this mother and daughter the parental and filial relations are inverted with courageous fidelity to life, where we as often see a judicious daughter holding an impulsive mother in check as the reverse. Clotilde is always shocked and troubled by her mother's wilful rashness, and Aurora, who is not so very much her senior, is always breaking bounds with a girlish impetuosity, which is only aggravated by the attempt to restrain it. These lovely ladies, who are in their way ladies to their finger tips, and are as gentle in breeding as they are simple in circumstance, shine to each other's advantage in the situations which contrast them, and it is in such situations that they are mostly seen. One such situation fixed itself in my mind at a first reading, and has remained there unfaded during the 20 years that have since elapsed, though I will not deny that I have several times refreshed my original sense of it. The reader who knows the book will not have forgotten the passage descriptive of Sieur Frauenfeld's call upon the ladies in their little house, when Clotilde and he try to ignore their unspoken love for each other in a sober discussion of the Creole's peculiarities, and Aurora, from whom their passion is of course less hidden than from themselves, dashes irrelevantly into the conversation from time to time, and turns the train of Frauenfeld's ideas topsy-turvy. It is all done with a delicacy, a gracious tenderness, enhanced by the author's sensitive rendering of the Creole ladies' accents in the English which they employ with the English-speaking young German pharmacist. But one despairs in quoting it, knowing that the quaint beauty of the characterization can be only suggested in such a fragment. The ladies were at home. Aurora herself opened the door, and Clotilde came forward from the bright fireplace with a cordiality never before so unqualified. There was something about these ladies in their simple but noble grace, in their half Gallic, half classic beauty, in a jocund buoyancy mated to an amiable dignity, that made them appear to the scholar as though they had just bounded into life from the garlanded procession of some old fresco. The resemblance was not a little helped on by the costume of the late Revolution, most acceptably chastened and belated by the distance from Paris. Their black hair, somewhat heavier on Clotilde's head, where it rippled once or twice, was knotted en grec, and adorned only with the spoils of a nosegay given to Clotilde by a chivalric small boy in the home of her music scholar. "We was expectin' you since several days," said Clotilde, as the three sat down before the fire, Frauenfeld in a cushioned chair whose moth holes had been carefully darned, and a few moments later the apothecary and both ladies, the one as fond of the abstract as the other two were ignorant of the concrete, were engaged in an animated running discussion on art, society, climate, education. Frauenfeld had never before spent such an hour. At its expiration he had so well held his own against both the others that the three had settled down to this sort of entertainment. Aurora would make an assertion, or Clotilde would ask a question, and Frauenfeld would present his opinions without the thought of a reservation either in himself or his hearers. On their part, they would sit in deep attention, shielding their faces from the fire, and responding to enunciations directly contrary to their convictions with an occasional yes'sah, or seddinly, or of co'se, or prettier affirmation still, a solemn drooping of the eyelids, a slight compression of the lips, and a low, slow declination of the head. The bane of all Creole art effort. We take up the apothecary's words at a point where Clotilde was leaning forward and slightly frowning in an honest attempt to comprehend his condensed English. The bane of all Creole art effort, so far as I have seen it, is amateurism. Amateur, murmured Clotilde, a little beclouded on the main word, and distracted by a French difference of meaning, but planting an elbow on one knee in the genuineness of her attention, and responding with a bow. That is to say, said Frauenfeld, apologizing for the homeliness of his further explanation by a smile, a kind of ambitious indolence that lays very large eggs, but can neither see the necessity for building a nest beforehand, nor command the patience to hatch the eggs afterwards. Of course, said Aurora. It is a great pity, said the sermonizer, looking at the face of Clotilde, elongated in the brass andiron, and after a pause, nothing on earth can take the place of hard and patient labor. But that in this community is not esteemed. Most sorts of it are contemned. The humbler sorts are despised, and the higher are regarded with mingled patronage and commiseration. Dose Creole is lazy, said Aurora. That is a hard word to apply to those who do not consciously deserve it, said Frauenfeld. But if they could only wake up to the fact, find it out themselves. Suddenly, said Clotilde. Sir Frauenfeld, said Aurora, leaning her hand on her side, some pipple thing it is dose climade. How you lag dose climade. I do not suppose, replied the visitor, there is a more delightful climate in the world. Ah! Both ladies at once, in a low, gracious tone of acknowledgment. I think Louisiana is a paradise, me, said Aurora. Were you goin' fin such a hair? She respired a sample of it. Were you goin' fin such a so ridge ground? De weed in my bag yard is 25 feet high. Ah, maman, 26, said Aurora, correcting herself. Yes, he said, breaking a contemplative pause, the climate is too comfortable, and the soil too rich, though I do not think it is entirely on their account that the people who enjoy them are so sadly in arrears to the civilized world. He blushed with the fear that his talk was bookish, and felt grateful to Clotilde for seeming to understand his speech. Why do you find de reason is, Sieur Frauenfeld? She asked. I do not wish to philosophize, he answered. May go home? May go ahead? Said both ladies, settling themselves. It is largely owing, exclaimed Frauenfeld, with sudden fervor, to a defective organization of society, which keeps this community, and will continue to keep it for an indefinite time to come, entirely unprepared and disinclined to follow the course of modern thought. Of course, murmured Aurora, who had lost her bearings almost at the first word. 2. It may very justly be urged that this is not drama, and very often, in the illustrative passages I have given in this series of studies, I have felt that they did not represent the heroines in those lime-lighted moments in which a heroine is supposed most to live. One has to choose between such moments and some quieter episode in which character softly unfolds itself, and its fascination penetrates like a perfume to the reader's sympathy, while his more tumultuous sensations are left unstirred. Then one has one's conscience as to the quality of the whole work in which the character is rooted, and of which it is the consummate flower. One must somehow do justice to that, and in reading Mr. Cable's novel one is afraid that nothing short of entreating the reader to go to it and do it justice himself will suffice. Not to make this beggarly default, however, one may remind him of the opalescent shimmer in which the story is wrapped, and from which keenly sparkle its facts and traits of comedy and tragedy. For a certain blend of romance and reality which does no wrong to either component property, I do not know its like in American fiction, and I feel that this is saying far too little. I might say in all fiction, and not accuse myself of extravagance. Short of this, I may safely declare it the author's masterpiece, on which he has lavished his happiest, if not his most conscious art. And Aurora Nancanoe is its supreme grace. What she is, otherwise, will not be readily put into words, even her own words. She is always the wild, wilful heart of girlhood, which the experiences of wifehood, motherhood, and widowhood have left unchanged. She is a woman with a grown-up daughter, but essentially she is her daughter's junior, and adorable as Clotilde is in her way, she pales and dulls into commonplace when Aurora is by. That last chapter, which is so apt to be an anticlimax in a novel, is so good in the grandest themes, and is so subtly interpretive of Aurora's personality, the sort of personality which
coquettes with itself to the very end, that I should like to give it entire, though I know that I should have still a haunting fear that without everything that had gone before the portrait of this bewitching creature would want its full effect. Honoré Grandissime, who has loved her through all the involutions of her caprice, has offered himself and been refused, and a scene follows which, among love scenes, has to my knowledge scarcely been surpassed in its delicious naturalness. If Monsieur Grandissime had believed that he was prepared for the supreme bitterness of that moment, he had sadly erred. He could not speak. He extended his hand in a dumb farewell, when, all unsanctioned by his will, the voice of despair escaped him in a low groan. At the same moment a tinkling sound drew near, and the room, which had grown dark with the fall of night, began to brighten with the softly widening light of an evening lamp, as a servant approached to place it in the front drawing-room. Aurora gave her hand and withdrew it. In the act the two somewhat changed position, and the rays of the lamp, as the maid passed the door, falling upon Aurora's face, betrayed the again upturned eyes. "Sieur Grandissime," they fell. The lover paused. "You think I'm cruel?" She was the statue of meekness. "Hope has been cruel to me," replied Monsieur Grandissime. "Not you. That I cannot say. Adieu." He was turning. "Sieur Grandissime." She seemed to tremble. He stood still. "Sieur Grandissime," her voice was very tender, "wad you hurry?" There was a great silence. "Sieur Grandissime, you know." "Take a chair." He hesitated a moment, and then both sat down. The servant repassed the door, yet when Aurora broke the silence, she spoke in English, having such hazardous things to say. It would conceal possible stammerings. "Sieur Grandissime, you know das wissen I." She slightly opened her fan, looking down upon it, and was still. "I have no right to ask the reason," said Mr. Grandissime. "It is yours, not mine." Her head went lower. "Well, you know." She drooped it meditatively to one side, with her eyes on the floor. "'Tis bekaus, 'tis bekaus I thing in a few days I'm goin' to die." Monsieur Grandissime said never a word. He was not alarmed. She looked up suddenly, and took a quick breath, as if to resume, but her eyes fell before his, and she said, in a tone of half soliloquy, "I have so much troub wid dat heart." She lifted one little hand feebly to the cardiac region, and sighed softly with a dying languor. Monsieur Grandissime gave no response. A vehicle rumbled by in the street below, and passed away. At the bottom of the room, where a gilded Mars was driving into battle, a soft note told the half hour. The lady spoke again. "I'd Madge," she sighed once more, "so strange. Sometime I thing I'm gettin' crazy." Still he, to whom these fearful disclosures were being made, remained as silent and motionless as an Indian captive, and after another pause, with its painful accompaniment of small sounds, the fair speaker resumed with more energy, as befitting the approach to an incredible climax. "Some day, Sieur Grandissime, I'd Madge me forged my hage. I thing I'm young." She lifted her eyes with the evident determination to meet his own squarely, but it was too much. They fell as before. Yet she went on speaking. "And when somebody gettin' tied livin' wid imself and beggin' to fillo and wan somebody to take de care of him and wan me to get married wid him, I thing he's in love to me." Her fingers kept up a little shuffling with the fan. "I thing I'm crazy. I thing I mus' be goin' to die toreckly." She looked up to the ceiling with large eyes, and then again at the fan in her lap, which continued its spreading and shutting. "And as de reason, Sieur Grandissime." She waited until it was certain he was about to answer, and then interrupted him nervously. "You know, Sieur Grandissime, it woun' be right. It woun' be justice to you, and you de bes' man I ever know in my life, Sieur Grandissime." Her hands shook. "A man what never wan to get married wid nobody in his life, and now tryin' to get married just only to repose de soul of his uncle." Monsieur Grandissime uttered an exclamation of protest, and she ceased. "I ask you," continued he, with low toned emphasis, "for the single and only reason that I want you for my wife.
"Yes," she quickly replied, "dat's all. Dat's what I think." "And I think dat's de right way to say, Sieur Grandison, because you know you and me is too hold to talk about dat lovin', you know, and you got dat great rispeg for me, and me I got dat is rispeg for you, but," she clutched the fan and her face sank lower. "Still, but," she swallowed, shook her head, but she bit her lip, she could not go on. "Aurora," said her lover, bending forward and taking one of her hands, "I do love you with all my soul." She made a poor attempt to withdraw her hand, abandoned the effort, and looked up savagely through a pair of overflowing eyes, demanding, "Mais for why you didn't want to say so?" Monsieur Grandison smiled argumentatively. "I have said so 100 times, in every way but in words." She lifted her head proudly, and bowed like a queen. "Mais you see, Sir Grandison, you bin meg one mistake." "But 'tis corrected in time," exclaimed he, with suppressed but eager joyousness. "Sieur Grandison," she said with a tremendous solemnity, "I'm very sorry, mais you spoke too late." "No, no," he cried, "the correction comes in time. Say that, lady, say that." His ardent gaze beat hers once more down, but she shook her head. He ignored the motion. "And you will correct your answer? Ah, say that, too," he insisted, covering the captive hand with both his own, and leaning forward from his seat. "Mais, Sieur Grandison, you know dat is so very unexpeg." "Oh, unexpected? Mais I was think all dat time it was Clotilde what you" She turned her face away and buried her mouth in her handkerchief. "Ah!" he cried, "mock me no more, Aurora Nancanoe." He rose erect and held the hand firmly which she strove to draw away. "Say the word, sweet lady, say the word." She turned upon him suddenly, rose to her feet, was speechless an instant, while her eyes flashed into his, and crying out, "No!" burst into tears, laughed through them, and let him clasp her to his bosom. Section 37 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. H. B. Fuller's Jane Marshall and Miss M. E. Wilkins's Jane Field. In the fiction of that group of Western novelists whom I think the most representative, I feel the heroines generally so much less important than the heroes, that I find myself in a difficulty which I will confess to the reader strictly upon the condition that it shall go no farther. I do this not only because I ought, but also because I must, for if I did not, the reader would himself perceive that either I have been wrong in claiming the supremacy of the heroine in a novel as proof of the author's mastery, or else that these Western novelists whom I like are really not masterly. What is certain is that their heroines are subordinate figures, and there is no way out for me, but possibly through the fact that the feminization of our American life, so apparent in and out of literature in the East, has not yet reached the new centers of population between the Alleghanies and the Mississippi, and that the Western subordination of the heroine is the instinctive response of fiction to the quantitative, if not the qualitative fact. To the casual glance, the West would seem, even more than the East, given up socially and intellectually to women. But so far women do not hold the first place in Western fiction. The type of Western womanhood studied in Selma, the heroine of Mr. Robert Grant's Unleavened Bread, is the creation or invention of a Boston novelist, who, in obedience to the Eastern tradition, gives her supremacy in his story. To be sure, Mr. Robert Herrick, in The Gospel of Freedom, made a Western woman the foremost figure in his story, but Mr. Herrick is of Bostonian birth like Mr. Grant, and though recently of Chicagoan adoption, is still imaginably of the earlier allegiance in his deference to the nearly and ever womanly Eastern fiction. In the work of a native Westerner, like Mr. Will Payne, the womanly, though so truly portrayed in such a story as The Money Captain, is subordinated in interest to the manly; and Mr. George Ade, whose brilliant divinations of feminine foible form the delightfulness of his stories and fables, gives his highest energies or inspirations to the study of persons of his own sex; and Doc Horne and Arty and Pink Marsh are his masterpieces in characterization. Mr. Hamlin Garland also is more memorable for his men than his women, and the critical trailer I am writing with the phraseology of his latest story insistently in mind will find the float of masculine character more abundant in his gold-bearing mountains than the surface indications of heroinism. In his earlier and shorter stories, and still in his shorter and later stories, you are aware of the manly sympathy which divines this precious metal, and the Rose, who is the Rose of Dutchers Cooley, is a genuine piece of womanhood, with both the material and the spiritual auræ which form its allure. She is imagined with a courage uncommon in our fiction, and portrayed with a conscience unable to spare the suggestions of undraped nature which our tradition blinks. It is no longer, as it is not yet, the time for such courage and conscience, and we still await a due heroine from a novelist whose work otherwise avouches his power in dealing with character. 1. Among Western novelists we must go to the page of Mr. Henry B. Fuller, apparently more sensitive to Eastern influences, or the Western advance of feminization for a heroine of the fit proportions. And I think we find her in one of the chief figures of the story, which is upon the whole the most representative of his native city. With the procession has not the epical motive of the cliff dwellers, but the epical motive always incurs the danger of turning mechanical, and with the procession escapes this, while it studies delicately but penetratingly the evolution of Chicago from a large town to a great city, in the inner and outer life of a typical family, which voluntarily and involuntarily prospers with it. The daughter of this family, who determines to make it share her own social consciousness, is a heroine of rare and even new kind. She begins properly to win the heart of the reader from the moment when, in view of her evident want of beauty and style, she humorously decides to be quaint, and to work life upon the lines of that decision. Her quaintness is not an affectation, but is the frank recognition of her material limitations, and she is powerfully abetted in her resolution by another person of the drama, who was a belle of an earlier period, but has become quaint inwardly, while appearing outwardly a figure of great social power and splendor. The management of these two delightful women is of the artistic sort which puts you in full possession of their quality without much advertising you of the process. This makes it difficult to give distinctive passages concerning them, but not impossible, and it is not without the hope of making my reader wish to know them better that I introduce them in the scene where they become fast friends. Jane Marshall, the younger of the friends, has gone from her father's old-fashioned house to the new-fashioned palace of Mrs. Granger Bates, to ask the social leader for a subscription in behalf of the working girls' club she is fostering; and after being snubbed and put down on general principles by the great lady, suddenly finds herself caught to her heart when Mrs. Bates learns that she is the daughter of David Marshall. For David Marshall, far back in the '50s, was a favorite beau of Mrs. Bates's, and she still has an honest tenderness for him. She takes the odd girl to her heart in every way, and leading her through the marble halls where she receives the world, she welcomes her to the little room where she lives. The door closed with a light click, and Jane looked about her with a great and sudden surprise. Poor, stupid, stumbling child! She understood at last in what spirit she had been received, and on what footing she had been placed. She found herself in a small, cramped, low-ceiled room, which was filled with worn and antiquated furniture. There was a ponderous old mahogany bureau, with the veneering cracked and peeled, and a bed to correspond. There was a shabby little writing desk, whose let-down lid was lined with faded and blotted green baize.
On the floor there was an old Brussels carpet, antique as to pattern and wholly threadbare as to surface. The walls were covered with an old-time paper whose plaintive primitiveness ran in slender pink stripes alternating with narrow green vines. In one corner stood a small upright piano, whose top was littered with loose sheets of old music, and on one wall hung a set of thin, black walnut shelves, strung together with cords, and loaded with a variety of well-worn volumes. In the grate was a coal fire. Mrs. Bates sat down on the foot of the bed, and motioned Jane to a small rocker that had been reseated with a bit of old rugging. Mrs. Bates had stepped to her single little window. "Isn't it a gem?" she asked. "I had it made to order. One of the old-fashioned sort, you see, 2 sash, with 6 little panes in each. No weights and cords, but simply catches at the side. It opens to just 2 widths. If I want anything different, I have to contrive it for myself. Sometimes I use a hairbrush, and sometimes a paper cutter. Do you like my posies?" She nodded towards the window, where, thanks to the hairbrush, a row of flowers in a long, narrow box blew about in the draught. "Asters?" "No, no, no. But I hoped you'd guess asters. They're chrysanthemums. You see, fashion will penetrate even here. But they're the smallest and simplest I could find. What do I care for orchids and American beauties, and all those other expensive things under glass? How much does it please me to have 2 great, big, formal beds of gladiolas and foliage plants in the front yard, one on each side of the steps? Still, with our position, I suppose it can't be helped. No, what I want is a bed of portulaca and some cypress vines running up strings to the top of a pole. As soon as I get poor enough to afford it, I'm going to have a lot of phlox and London pride and bachelor's buttons out there in the backyard, and the girls can run their clotheslines somewhere else." "It's hard to keep flowers in a city," said Jane. "I know it is. At our old house we had such a nice little rose bush in the front yard. I hated so to leave it behind, one of those little yellow briar roses. No, it wasn't yellow, it was just yaller, and it always scratched my nose when I tried to smell it. But oh, child," wistfully, "if I could only smell it now. Couldn't you have transplanted it?" asked Jane, sympathetically. "I went back the very next day after we moved out, with a peach basket and a fire shovel, but my poor bush was buried under 7 feet of yellow sand. To day there's 7 stories of brick and mortar, so all I've got from the old place is just this furniture of moss and the wall-paper." "The wall-paper?" "Not the identical same, of course. It's like what I had in my bedroom when I was a girl. I remembered the pattern, and tried everywhere to match it, and finally" "Well, what finally?" "Finally I sent down East and had 8 or 10 rolls made to order. I chased harder than anybody ever chased for a Raphael, and I spent more than if I had hung the room with Gobelins. But" she stroked the narrow strips of pink and green with a fond hand, and cast on Jane a look which pleaded indulgence. "Isn't it just too quaintly ugly for anything?" "It isn't any such thing," cried Jane. "It's just as sweet as it can be. I only wish mine was like it." Mrs. Bates began to rummage among the drawers of her old desk. "There," she said presently, "I knew I could put my hands on it." She set a daguerreotype before Jane. Its oval was bordered with a narrow line of gilded metal, and its small square back was covered with embossed brown leather. "There, now, do you know who that is?" Jane looked back and forth, doubtfully, between the picture and its owner. "Is it Pa?" Mrs. Bates nodded. Jane regarded the daguerreotype with a puzzled fascination. "Did my father ever wear his hair all wavy across his forehead that way, and have such a thing tied around his throat, and wear a vest all covered with those little gold sprigs?" "Precisely. That's just the way he looked the last time we danced together. And what do you suppose the dance was? Guess and guess and guess again. It was this." Mrs. Bates whisked herself on to the piano stool, and began to play and to sing. Her touch was heavy and spirited, but her voice was easily audible above the instrument. "Old Dan Tucker, he got drunk, he jumped in the fire, and he kicked up a chunk of red hot charcoal with his shoes. Lordy, how the ashes flew hoo!"
Jane dropped the daguerreotype in time to take up the refrain. "Clear the road for old Dan Tucker. You're too late to get your supper. Clear the road for old Dan—" "Aha! You know it!" cried Mrs. Bates, gaily. "Of course," responded Jane. "My education may be modern on the whole, but it hasn't neglected the classics completely. Gentlemen forward!" she said, with a sudden cry which sent Mrs. Bates's fingers back to the keyboard. "Gentlemen forward to Mr. Tucker." Mrs. Bates pounded loudly, and Jane pirouetted up to her from behind. "Ladies forward to Mr. Tucker!" cried Jane, and Mrs. Bates left the stool and began dancing towards her. Then she danced back and took her seat again, but with the first chord. "All forward to Miss Tucker!" called Jane again, and they met face to face in the middle of the room and burst out laughing. "Sit down. I'm going to play the Java March for you." She struck out several ponderous and vengeful chords. "Why," called Jane, "is that the Java March?" She spread out her elbows and stalked up and down singing, "Oh, the Dutch Companie is the best companie." "Right again!" cried Mrs. Bates. "You are one of us, just as I said." "Well, if that's the Java March," said Jane, "it's in an old book we used to have about the house, years and years ago. Only if you bring it up as an example of Pa's taste—" "He liked it because I played it, perhaps," said Mrs. Bates, quietly. "Besides, why should you put it to those shocking words? It is in that book," she continued, "and I've got one here just like it." "Is it the one with 'Roll on, silver moon,' and 'Wild rove the Indian maid, bright what's her name, bright Alfarada'?" "Same one, exactly. Bring up another chair, and we'll go through a whole programme of classics. Program, I mean." "Let's see, though," said Jane, looking at her watch. "Mercy me, where has the morning gone? It's after 11 o'clock." Mrs. Bates opened the front door herself. "You can take the choo choo cars at 16th, you know, and get off at Van Buren. Oh, dear, excuse my baby talk. Our little Reginald, 2 months old, you know." She accompanied Jane half way down the steps, bareheaded as she was, and in her morning gown. A society reporter who happened to be passing originated the rumour that she had gone insane. If, after all, these passages are illustrative of Mrs. Bates rather than of Jane Marshall, it is perhaps because Jane Marshall is less susceptible of illustration by select passages. She is a singularly undramatic heroine, and lives in a sort of subjectivity more perceptible than demonstrable to the sympathetic reader's knowledge of her faithful and lovable character. In fact, the scene given displays only that surface of her character which is the least significant of her quality. It is her hard fate, through her zeal for her father's standing, and her pride in him, to rend him and her mother from the ugly, old-fashioned keeping in which they were peacefully rusting out their lives, and get them into the procession. And when her father falls out of it, dying, she feels as if she had killed him. But she really has not. She has been the truest and kindest of all his children to him, and she has her reward when the faithful Theodore Brower, long mute with love for her, takes heart at the funeral to say that he will go as one of the family and in the same carriage as her, or not go at all. The grotesqueness is not blinked, but the pathos is delicately intimated in it. And throughout the story the blunt, angular, outright nature of the girl is studied with constant recognition of her sweetness and unselfish goodness, and her humorous self-depreciation. She is but one of many women in the story whose personalities are all rendered with an unerring touch. 2. To pass from the atmosphere of Mr. Fuller's With the Procession to Miss Mary E. Wilkins's Jane Field is to make proof at once of the variety and the solidarity of American life. Nothing as to conditions could be farther apart than Chicago and Green River. And yet the vast, loud, lavish metropolis of the West and the prim, meagre, niggard New England village are animated by the same ideal of conduct, the same puritanized conscience, the same desire of justice and righteousness. The Chicago family, in dealing with the problem of the iniquitous son and brother whose sin has followed him home from Europe, is of as simple and direct an impulse as Jane Field in her self-denunciation to those she has deceived, in her too ingenious endeavor for justice. And when it appears that money will serve quite as well as marriage, or better, they feel a noble shame in compounding the wrong of a like quality with Lois Field's sense of dishonour in silently witnessing her mother's trespass. It is in the Europeanized and modernized black sheep of the Chicago fold that the differentiation of ideal takes place, but his aberration from the home standard is as wide in his Chicago domestic circle as it would be in Green River. The delight of the higher probability must remain with the Western novelist, who is realistic through and through, whereas the New England novelist is at heart romantic and realistic mainly in expression. She narrowly escapes the impossible in her plot and saves herself from point to point in the story by clever devices and agile turns which tax the credulity of the reader rather than raise his admiration. They ask him to grant premises, but the true plot, the situation that reproduces life, compels him to grant them. Nevertheless, it is fairly possible, if not that it is unfairly possible, that Jane feels, seeing her frail young daughter dying before her eyes in a pitiless decline, as she believes, for want of rest from work and change of air, should bethink herself of the inheritance left her dead sister, and cloudily keeping in mind her extraordinary resemblance to her sister, should suffer herself to be mistaken for her, and should try to enter into the enjoyment of her own rights through her sister's property. The reader of the story, so powerful in spite of its inherent weaknesses, will remember that her sister's husband has lost all her own little fortune in speculation, and that Jane Field has no purpose but to recover the value of her $1,500. It is with this purpose that she goes to Eliot, 100 miles away from Green River, to seek her just dues from the estate which must, upon her sister's death being known, revert to the family of her sister's husband. The lawyer who has the property in charge greets Mrs. Field as Mrs. Maxwell, and in the sudden crazy hope of turning his error to her account without infringing the just rights of the loyal heirs, she does not correct him. It is her dim, unformulated notion that she may collect her dues to the amount of the $1,500 lost from the income of the property, and then relinquish possession. But when her daughter follows her to Eliot and sets her pitiless young conscience in condemnation over the mother who has taken this desperate chance for her sake, Jane Field finds it impossible to touch a cent of her dues. They put everything by for the legal owners, and cower in the old Maxwell house, keeping themselves from starvation by the little that Lois can earn in sewing, till a visit from some old Green River neighbors deepens the stress of her sin upon Jane Field and drives her to anticipate detection by denouncing herself to the whole village of Eliot. You can drive a coach through several places in this loose structure, but if you have no wish for such an excursion, you can enjoy the psychology of the tremendous situation as it is worked out in the characters of the mother and daughter. Lois first unexpectedly appears at Eliot the morning after her mother's arrival. They meet at the lawyer's office, where Jane Field is talking of the property with him, and she is obliged to introduce Lois as her niece, or rather to let the lawyer deceive himself as to their relation. She keeps as far as she can from positive deception, and then the mother and daughter go home to the Maxwell house together. Mrs. Field stalked ahead with her resolute stiffness. Lois followed after her, keeping always several paces behind. No matter how often Mrs. Field, sternly conscious of it, slackened her own pace, Lois never gained upon her. When they reached the gate at the entrance of the Maxwell grounds, and Mrs. Field stopped, Lois spoke up. "What place is this?" said she, in a defiantly timorous voice. "The Maxwell house," replied her mother, shortly, turning up the walk. "Are you going in here?" "Of course I am." "Well, I ain't going in one step." Mrs. Field turned and faced her. "Lois," said she, "if you want to go away and desert the mother that's showin' herself willin' to die for you, you can." Lois said not another word. She turned in at the gate with her eyes fixed upon her mother's face. "I'll tell you about it when we get up to the house," said her mother, with appealing conciliation. Lois slunk mutely behind her again. Her eyes were full of the impulse of flight when she watched her mother unlock the house door, but she followed her in. "Now, Lois," said Mrs. Field, "I'm going to tell you about this. You know, I suppose, that Mr. Tewkesbury took me for your Aunt Esther." Lois nodded. Her dilated eyes never wavered from her mother's face. "I suppose you heard what he was saying to me when you come in." "Lois, I didn't tell him I was your Aunt Esther. The minute I come in, he took me for her. And Miss Henry Maxwell come into his office, and she did, and so did Mr. Tewkesbury's sister. I wan't goin' to tell them I want her."
and I'll tell you why. I'm going to have that $1,500 of your poor father's earnin' that I lent your uncle out of this property, and this is all the way to do it, and I'm going to do it. Couldn't you have asked the lawyer about the $1,500? Wouldn't he have given you some? Oh, mother! I was going to if he hadn't took me for her, but it wouldn't have done any good. They wouldn't have been obliged to pay it, and folks ain't fond of paying over money when they ain't obliged to. I've been a fool to have asked him after he took me for her. Then you'd got this all planned? Her mother took her up sharply. No, I hadn't got it all planned, said she. I don't deny it come into my head. I knew how much folks said I looked like Esther, but I didn't go so far as to plan it. There needn't anybody say I did. You ain't going to take the money? I'm going to take that $1,500 out of it. Mother, you ain't going to stay here and make folks think you're Aunt Esther. Yes, I am. Then all Lois's horror and terror manifested themselves in one cry. Oh, mother! When the fierce sense of wrong subsides and the iron purpose of righting herself breaks in Jane Field, her relentless will asserts itself again in the impulse to punish herself for the deceit she has practised, and to take the consequences of her transgression before all the world, and she begins with the 3 old Green River neighbors who are visiting her. When Lois left home that afternoon, her mother had been in her bedroom changing her dress. When she came out, she had on her best black dress, her black shawl and gloves, and her best bonnet. The 3 women stared at her. She stood before them a second without speaking. The strange look for which Lois had watched her face had appeared. "Why, what is the matter, Miss Field?" cried Mrs. Babcock. "Where be you goin'?" "I'm goin' out a little ways," replied Mrs. Field. Then she raised her voice suddenly. "I've got something to say to all of you before I go," said she. "I've been deceiving you and everybody here in Eliot. When I came down here, they all took me for my sister, Esther Maxwell, and I let them think so. They've all called me Esther Maxwell here. That's how I got the money. Old Mr. Maxwell left it to Flora Maxwell if my sister didn't outlive him. I shouldn't have had a cent. I stole it. I thought my daughter would die if she didn't have it and get away from Green River, but that wa'n't any excuse. Edward Maxwell had that $1,500 of my husband's, and I never had a cent of it, but that wa'n't any excuse. I thought I'd just stay here and carry it out till I got the money back, but that wa'n't any excuse. I ain't spent a cent of the money. It's all put away just as it was paid him in a sugar bowl in the china closet, but that ain't any excuse. I took it on myself to do justice instead of the Lord, and that ain't for any human being to do. I ain't Esther Maxwell. I'm brought up short. I ain't Esther Maxwell." Her voice rose to a stern shriek. The 3 women stared at her, then at each other. Their faces were white. Amanda was catching her breath and faint gasp. Jane Field rushed out of the room. The door closed heavily after her. 3 wild, pale faces huddled together in a window watched her out of the yard. Mrs. Babcock called weakly after her to come back, but she kept on. She went out of the yard and down the street. At the first house she stopped, went up to the door and rang the bell. When a woman answered her ring, she looked at her and said, "I ain't Esther Maxwell." Then she turned and went down the walk between the rows of marigolds and asters, and the woman stood staring after her for a minute, then ran in, and the windows filled with wondering faces. Jane Field stopped at the next house with the same message. After she left, a woman pelted across the yard. In a panic to compare notes with her neighbors, she kept on down the street, and she stopped at every door and said, "I ain't Esther Maxwell." Now and then somebody tried to delay her, to question her and obtain an explanation, but she broke away. There was about her a terrible mental impetus which intimidated. People stood instinctively out of her way, as before some rushing force which might overwhelm them. She went on and on, all the summer afternoon, and canvassed the little village with her remorse and confession of crime. Finally, the 4 words which she said at the doors seemed almost involuntary. They became her one natural note, the expression of her whole life. It was as if she had never said any others. When she went up the path to the Maxwell house, she said them where the shadow of a pine tree fell darkly in front of her like the shadow of a man. She said them when she stood before the door of the house whose hospitality she had usurped. There was a little crowd at her heels, but she did not notice them until she was entering the door. Then she said the words over to them. "I ain't Esther Maxwell." She entered the sitting room, the people following. There were her 3 old friends and neighbors, the minister and his wife, Daniel Tuxbury, his sister and her daughter, Mrs. Jane Maxwell, and her daughter, and her own Lois. She faced them all and said it again, "I ain't Esther Maxwell." Lois pressed forward and clung to her. "Mother," she moaned, "mother." Then for once her mother varied her set speech. "Lois wa'n't to blame," she said. "I want you to know it, all of you. Lois wa'n't to blame." She didn't know until after I'd done it. She wanted to tell, but I told her they'd put me in prison. Lois wa'n't to blame. I ain't Esther Maxwell. Oh, mother, don't. Lois sobbed. She hung about her mother's neck and pressed her lips to that pale, wrinkled face, whose wrinkles seemed now to be laid in stone. Not a muscle of Jane Field's face changed. She kept repeating at intervals in precisely the same tone her terrible underchord to all the excitement about her. I ain't Esther Maxwell. End of section 37.
Section 38 of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Humphry Ward's Heroines. In reading Mrs. Humphry Ward's last story, Eleanor, I felt again, as I had felt before in her work, its general difference from the best American fiction in a particular which may perhaps have caught the notice of others. If it has not, I may be mistaken in my feeling, and shall be unable to persuade others to make it their conviction. But the point is interesting, and if I can make it evident, something will have been done toward explaining American novelists to themselves, and reconciling them to their performances as the necessary outcome of their conditions. Possibly something more will have been done, and they will be satisfied in recognizing that English breadth must always be denied them, and to make the most of the depth which seems to be their characteristic when they are at their best. 1. The deceitfulness of appearances is notorious, and even when they are the effect of reality, they are seldom of such a unanimity that the inference from them cannot reasonably be questioned. You have first to get your appearances, and this alone is a thing of no small difficulty. Many appearances are so purely subjective that when you come to draw the attention of others to them, they turn out to be disappearances. And in the case in hand there will probably be some people to deny that English fiction is noticeably broad, or American fiction noticeably deep. They will say that Thomas Hardy and George Eliot have both written things that suggest depth as well as breadth, and that Mrs. Ward, who is alone among English writers worthy to be mentioned with these novelists, is so much of the American spirit in her art that, if her work is broad, it is a proof that breadth is as characteristic of American fiction as depth. The effect is to dissatisfy you with the words themselves as saying too much, and if, after trying dramatic and epical, you return to them, you wish to explain that you employ neither invidiously, but only with the single desire to trace certain questionable appearances to certain unquestionable facts, and so render them less questionable. I confess that the effect of the breadth I have felt, or seemed to feel, in Mrs. Ward's work was such as to make me discontented with the depth that I remembered in the best American work, as if this were comparatively a defect, since it was necessarily narrower. It was only by reflecting that our depth was the inevitable implication of our civic and social conditions that I was consoled, and restored to something like a national self-respect. To put it paradoxically, our life is too large for our art to be broad. In despair at the immense scope and variety of the material offered it by American civilization, American fiction must specialize, and turning distracted from the superabundance of character, it must burrow far down in a soul or two. Men may invent almost anything but themselves, and it was not because Hawthorne made himself psychological, but because he was so, that in the American environment he bent his vision inward. His theory was that our life was too level and too open and too sunnily prosperous for his art, but it was an instinct far subtler than this belief that he obeyed in seeking the subliminal drama. Hawthorne was romantic, but our realists who have followed him have been of the same instinct, and have dealt mainly with the subliminal drama too. In their books, so faithful to the effect of our everyday life, the practical concerns of it are subordinated to the psychical, not consciously, but so constantly that their subordination has not been a matter of any question. The usual incidents of fiction have not, in the best American novelists, been the prime concern, but the subliminal effect of those incidents. Love itself, which is the meat and drink of fiction, is treated less as a passional than as a psychological phenomenon. Long ago, the more artistic of our novelists perceived that the important matter was not what the lovers suffered or enjoyed in getting married, or whether they got married at all or not, but what sort of man and maid their love found them out to be, and how, under its influence, the mutual chemistry of their natures interacted. All the problems, in any case, are incomparably simplified for the English novelist by the definite English conditions. One can no longer call them fixed, but they are still definite, and in a certain way character proceeds from them. The character of a gentleman, a businessman, an artisan, a servant, a laborer, each of these has his being in a way so different from the others that he is a definitely different creature. And when through some chance, some perverse mixture of the elements, the conditions are traversed, and the character bred of one shows itself in another, it has a stronger relief from the alien background. But ordinarily the Englishman feels, thinks, and acts from his class, and when you name his class, you measurably state him. After that, you have rather to do with what he does than what he is. The result in fiction is a multiplicity of incident and a multitude of persons, and you have breadth rather than depth. Even in so psychological a story as Mrs. Ward's Marcella, the definite conditions account for so much that it is, after all, a study of incident more than a study of motive. The conventions of English realism, the county society, and the life of the great houses, and interests and opinions of the gentry and their dependents, the hovels and the physical and moral squalor of the poor, the parliamentary election, and the agitations of the demagogues and the real reformers, the intervention of the church in the chapel, the poaching and the murder and the hanging, all these things are of the familiar acquaintance of the novel reader who knows them from the time of Bulwer down through the innumerable novelists who have treated of them since. Mrs. Ward treats of them with a fresh mind, but they are in themselves so far from fresh that they seem to stale her thought of them, and the figure that she projects against them, the very novel and very original figure of Marcella, seems to acquire convention from them, and to be as hackneyed as all the rest. The result is a fiction of high order, of a higher order in certain aspects than any since George Eliot's fictions, and yet having breadth rather than depth. This may be an appearance and not a fact. Marcella is so essentially modern, so perfectly of the day before yesterday, that the inquiry into the soul of the socialistic aesthete, the girl of good birth and good tradition, emerging from her shady father's past to find herself engaged to the most conscientious and noble-minded of aristocrats, but at war with all his convictions through the impassioned preferences of her earlier associations, necessarily involves psychological research which goes far if it does not go deep. She is indeed so interesting that one wishes the author might have had her in the sparsely settled region of an American fiction, so that we could have sat down with her in the long leisure of our social existence, and divined her to the ultimate mystery of her being. It may be answered that there is really no more of her than her author shows, but it seems as if, in a different environment, there might have been more. Possibly we touch here a fundamental variance of the English and American life. In former times we Americans were accused of being curious, over-curious, of being insatiable and impertinent questioners of strangers. It may be, however, that we are not so, but that the most penetrating difference between us and the English is that they are social and we are personal. Their denser life, we will say, satisfies them with superficial contrasts, while in our thinner and more homogeneous society the contrasts that satisfy are subliminal. This theory would account for their breadth and our depth, without mortifying the self-love of either, which I should like to spare, in our case, if not in theirs. To float and to dive may be equally creditable. Our personality is the consequence of our historic sparsity, and it survives beyond its time because the nature of our contiguity is still such as to fix a man's mind strongly upon himself, and to render him restless till he has ascertained how far all other men are like him. We are prodigiously homogeneous, though in the absence of classification we seem so chaotic. We shall change, probably, and then the character of our fiction, our art of representing life, will change too. Very likely it will become more superficial and less subliminal. It will lose in depth as it gains in breadth. As yet, its attempts to be broad, to be society fiction, have resulted in a shallowness which is not suggestive of breadth. 2. The English are less apt than we have been to carry a story abroad, and to find in an alien setting terms more favorable than those of home for the subliminal interests. This may be because they inevitably carry their civilization with them in all possible details down to the emblematic bathtub, while we find that we can get on abroad fairly well without steam heat and exposed plumbing, and the American order which they stand for. We are, in fact, far more easily detachable from our native background, and blend far more readily with the alien atmosphere than the English; so that I think if an American family, as nearly as possible corresponding to the Manistes, had been set down in the air of Rome, they would have lost their native outline more. The thing is hard to say, and perhaps I shall come as near to suggesting it as may be in noting the impression that the cosmopolitan Englishman gives of being more English than if he had never left home, whereas the cosmopolitan American really ceases to be American if he does not become anything else. Of course, my position can be assailed by saying that there could not be any such American family as the Manistes, who are distinctively and inalienably English, and are of that world which, whether it is really great or not, makes ours look a small world. Manisti has had to do all his life with questions which affect politically, socially, and spiritually the civilization of many races, systems, languages, and religions, as no American public man can have to do with them. And Eleanor Burgoyne, through the English traditions which admit women to the discussion of such questions, is of a range of thinking and feeling possible to no American woman, except someone who has given up society and gone in for a public life, through the advocacy of a great interest, like temperance or the suffrage for women. I allow that all this is true, without allowing all its implications; and in the meantime I fall back to my original position, and invite the reader again to consider whether the fact does not make for that breadth in English fiction which I began by imagining. We will suppose that the author, for the sake of getting her main group of people face to face with each other, and keeping them to their psychological problem, wishes to isolate them from the alliances and relations of their past, and therefore takes them into an alien environment. Almost immediately it proves that she has not isolated the English Manisti and Eleanor, but only the American girl, Lucy Foster. With the others, questions of European policy at once come in, and distract their attention from the psychological problem. To Lucy alone, these questions are without vital interest, if not without reality. Priests, diplomats, peasants, artists, citizens, society figures come and go in her consciousness, with the effect of deepening it inward and concentrating it in the great question whether she is doing wrong in letting Meniste love her, or letting herself love him, when she feels or knows that Eleanor loves him. If the situation had been invented by an American novelist, I think he would have studied it, mainly through the consciousness of Lucy, and the prime interest of the story would have been personal, psychological, subliminal. The effect would have been depth, and I do not mean this in any bragging way. Now the main effect is breadth, which certainly I could not mean derogatorily. It is indifferent to me for the present inquiry whether the American or the English effect is better, and I wish to note, without disparagement of Mrs. Ward's work, that Mr. Hardy gets depth by dealing with persons who are unconventionally circumstanced, or wholly out of society. For much the same reason, the author of the remarkable Mark Rutherford books is able to get it. But these alone, among English novelists, get it in anything like the American measure. Is it true, then, that the Americans get it because their characters are unconventionally circumstanced, or are not in society? Something very like this might be true, and American fiction is faithfuler to the average American conditions than if it dealt with people conventionally circumstanced and in society. For most of us are certainly not so, as most equally educated Englishmen certainly are so. We have the forms, the society structure's the same with us, but having built our house and furnished it, we find it a bother, and would rather lodge at a hotel and dine at a restaurant. Still better, we like to travel, to journey, and sojourn in far countries, and amidst the outer strangeness to get more intimately at our inner selves. If we are novelists, we like to take our characters abroad, as if the home sparsity were not enough, and in the resulting isolation to penetrate the last recesses of their mystery, or at least learn that it is not penetrable. More than one piece of our subtlety in this sort could be alleged, but perhaps it is sufficient to allege two, of which what I am saying seems eminently true, namely, the Marble Faun and Daisy Miller. If an English novelist does the same thing, the result is not the same. The English environment is inalienable. The characters are continually frittering themselves away in superficial encounter on the native terms, at dinners and luncheons and teas and what not, till there is nothing subliminal left in them. 3. One great objection to words is that they are always oversaying things, and I could easily take up the foregoing postulate and show it untenably excessive. Nevertheless, I think it has some truth in it, and I feel concerning Eleanor Burgoyne that she is not enough alone for the evolution of her innermost self. She is always in a clutter of society, which is right enough, since she is of that English world so cluttered. To our elbow-roomy American sense, as we view it afar or anear, even in her withdrawals from it in pain or in passion, the atmosphere of drawing-rooms seems to envelop her. It is her native air, and one cannot complain, though one feels that a final knowledge of what she might otherwise have been to the reader must be postponed to a future life. What she could be in this, hampered by the perpetual coming and going, and meeting and parting, is a most generously imagined personality. In fact, Mrs. Ward is so good at imagining heroines of noble nature that she ought to be the favorite novelist of her sex, which loves to have its magnanimity recognized, I will not say flattered. The wife of David Grieve, in the novel of his name, is one of these great creatures, and worthily the heroine of what I am not going rashly to call the author's best book, though I should not dispute such a verdict from another. I think it was contrived that the reader should meet her on a more subliminal level than most other English heroines, and this was perhaps so because she was of a social world almost as uncrowded as our own, and perhaps also because there is something much more analogous to the American in the Scotch nature than in the English. I am writing without the book, but after the 5 years which have passed since I read that powerful story, she is still present in a sort of tender sublimity, as the fit impersonation of the sacred love whose flame purifies David Grieve's soul of all but the record of his profaner passion. So much may be expected and exacted of the type of heroine which Mrs. Ward imagines, that the noble goodness of Marcella Maxwell, when she reappears in the story of Sir George Tressady, can have force not only to regenerate the feeling of Sir George toward herself, and transform it to an exalted friendship, but also to turn the jealousy of Lady Tressady to some such complexion. Can such things be? One asks one's self, and then is ashamed of one's self for asking, for doubting. Yet Lady Tressady, in her prettiness and pettiness, her vanity and vulgarity, has the superior probability, and is, I am tempted to say it, more profoundly divined than Marcella. In fact, Marcella loses probability in her second avatar, as socialistic wife to a socializing prime minister. In the scheme of Sir George Tressady, the ideal beauty of soul, so courageously imagined for her, scarcely recompenses the reader for this loss, though he must honour the courage. Her apparition to Tressady, crushed and dying in the coal mine, is not of the convincing supernaturalism to which Turgenev and Tolstoy have sometimes carried their naturalism. And her personal beauty, which is so constantly insisted upon, seems at each insistence less impressive. At the risk of being insufferably paradoxical, I should say that Marcella was left less appreciable by being left too little a mystery, and that in being altogether removed from the vague, she is rendered impalpable to those perceptions which realize personalities. To put it still more perversely, we meet her too often to know her thoroughly. We know little, light, hard Letty Tressady far better. We have a sense of her; she is the more convincing, because, to the very last, we are no more convinced than she is that she is not still jealous of her husband with respect to Marcella, though she is no longer jealous of Marcella with respect to her husband. She has forgiven, but she has not forgotten, and she remains with the reader in the luminous question, whether she will like being commended to the care of Marcella and Lord Maxwell by her dying husband. In suggesting such a question, the author evinces psychological depth, and in questions equally incapable of final answer, in the case of both the wife and the mistress in David Grieve, I find proof of a depth in that novel beyond that of any other of Mrs. Ward's books. The wife's relation to David's past amour remains full of satisfying mystery, and in the feeling of the French girl who forsakes him for her art, and escapes in terror from her love of him, there is something that seems to penetrate the very sources of her nature. 4. Of course I am aware of proving too much, but if I am getting at the truth, I do not much mind being inconsistent, or even finding myself wrong. If my thesis is that Mrs. Ward, when her fiction deals with the more crowded scenes of English life, loses depth, and when it deals with a sparser environment gains depth, perhaps I shall not find myself so very wrong after all. I should still have to ask myself how far she had sought such an environment in laying the scene of her last novel in Italy, and in giving her English heroine the relief of an alien setting; how far such a motive was subconscious with her, and how far she had failed to give it effect. I have already intimated my sense of her comparative failure, and as for the subconscious motive, that is something that I know of no critical subtlety competent to render evident. The question which remains is, in what degree the inevitable spread of the story has superficialized the heroine's character, or perhaps the impression of her character. What one has to do in any case is to recognize the courageous originality with which Eleanor Burgoyne is imagined. She has been married to a sufficiently unlovable and unloving husband, whose delirious suicide has involved the death of their little son. She struggles up from her crushing sorrow, and in making herself useful to her cousin Meneste, as his secretary and counsellor in his work, she finds not respite
from her grief so much as the chance of new happiness and the hope of his love. But she loves him too well and unwisely to be his unsparing critic, and when the unformed American girl, Lucy Foster, comes into their family circle, and from the fearlessness of her absolute sincerity censures where Elinor has not the heart to censure, Elinor has the anguish of seeing the man's fancy veered toward the girl as one of greater authority. Lucy is beautiful, and Elinor, in the first days, has devoted her taste and knowledge to making her more evidently beautiful. The feeling that she has toward her is not jealousy, or else it is a jealousy so sublimed by her noble nature that it is rather a recognition of the facts than a resentment of them. She weakens, indeed, so far as to put the case to Lucy, and ask her to give Meneste up to the love which has earned him but not won him, and the girl consents. But both their wills are crushed in Meneste's when he makes it plain that his love has nothing to do with justice, and that he wants what he wants, not because it is best or impersonally right, but because he wants it. This is the way of true love, which we are always exalting as the finest thing in the world, though there are obviously many things finer. It is at least honest and sincere, and that is what Eleanor Burgoyne owns in her acquiescence with fate, when she renders Lucy up to her inevitable happiness, if it is happiness to marry Meneste. That the woman should ask the girl to forego her happiness is a daring supposition in which we must acknowledge the author's high aesthetic courage, and perhaps the frankness, which is almost brutal, in Eleanor's despair, is truer than any fineness would have been. The contrast of the two lives in that scene, the woman's experience and the girl's innocence, is more valuable than the contrast even of their natures. But possibly in this also the author's work lends itself to my theory of greater breadth and less depth in the English novel as compared with the American. Nothing of subconscious, of subliminal, is left to the reader's conjecture. But I do not at all mean that character is rendered superficial by bringing everything in it to the surface. I am far too fond of the plain light of day for that. But still it may be so contrived that the plain light of day may strike to the nethermost abysses, and that what is most intricate and most recondite in the soul may be rendered luminously apparent at its proper depth. 5. The personality and the dramatic office of Eleanor are greatly imagined, and they remain essentially unaffected by the handling. You get the meaning of her tragedy, and the innermost meaning, which is perhaps less poignant than it might be if it were relieved by comedy. Mrs. Ward is serious, and no doubt in this she has her strongest hold upon her vast public, for the average woman, if not the average man, likes her prophets or prophetesses always to seem as much in earnest as they are. Through the absence of humour, Mrs. Ward is a little lower, if one chooses to think so, than that great woman novelist whose level she more nearly reaches than any of her successors. You cannot quite name her in the same breath with George Eliot, but you can name her in the next breath, and it is to be questioned if even George Eliot had a wider and stronger grasp of the important actualities of English life. In Eleanor, whether the book tells for or against my theory of greater depth in American fiction and greater breadth in the English, one must acknowledge that increasing mastery of which each of her successive books has given proofs. She has risen to her present eminence so wholly since American fiction began to shape itself from the art of continental fiction that one might almost claim an American influence in her work. But that might well be claiming too much. Her manner is still marked by the ejaculatory and suspiratory self-indulgence of the minor English novelists, to which George Eliot herself was not superior. She draws her breath in open pathos, and she caresses a situation or a character with a pitying epithet or adjective, as George Eliot does in the case of some heroines she likes very much, notably Maggie Tulliver or Janet Dempster, and less notably Dorothea Brooke. The foible is characteristic of all but the finest artists in English fiction, and in her greater moments Mrs. Ward does not indulge it. There is nothing of this weak pity of her own creations in such a scene as that where Eleanor reverses her prayer to Lucy Foster, and baring her wasted neck to show herself a dying woman, makes the girl promise to be true to the love between her and Meneste. The most touching moment of the whole story, That when she asks Manistee to carry her up the stairs is of an intense pathos, enfeebled by no suggestion of feeling in the author. Eleanor, with her hand on Marie's arm, tottered across the courtyard. At the convent door her strength failed her. She turned to Manistee. "I can't walk up those stairs. Do you think you could carry me?" "I am very light." Struck with sudden emotion, he threw his arms round her. She yielded like a tired child. He, who had instinctively prepared himself for a certain weight, was aghast at the ease with which he lifted her. Her head, in its pretty black hat, fell against his breast. Her eyes closed. He wondered if she had fainted. He carried her to her own room, and laid her on the sofa there. As he left the room, Eleanor settled down happily on her pillow. "The first and only time," she thought. My heart on his, my arms round his neck. There must be impressions that outlast all others. I shall manage to put them all away at the end. But that Such a passage, and it is by no means the only passage of its kind in the book, is of a fineness so penetrating, so far reaching, that a critic more enamoured of his thesis than I might own it a proof against him. If he had been arguing that English fiction had breadth but wanted depth, he might urge that it was one of the exceptions which proved the rule. But I prefer to save myself by a little different means, and referring to a suggestion already made somewhat faint-heartedly, I would leave it to the candid reader to say whether in such instances Mrs. Ward was not rather like the American than the English novelists. End of Section 38. End of Heroines of Fiction by William Dean Howells.